Part 2, Chapter 4 of En route by Joris-Karl HUYSMANS, translated by Charles Kegan Paul. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. When he left his cell, he said to himself, "This morning I shall communicate." And these words, which should have thrilled him through and through, woke no zeal in him. He remained dull, tired, and caring for nothing, feeling cold in the depth of his being. Nevertheless, a fear stimulated him when he was outside. "I do not know," he said to himself, "when I must leave my seat and go to kneel before the priest. I know that the congregation should communicate after the celebrant, but at what moment exactly ought I to move? It is indeed another misfortune that I should have to go up, alone, towards this table which so disturbs me. Otherwise I shall only have to follow the others and at least be sure of not doing anything improperly." He scrutinized the chapel as he went in, looking round for Monsieur Bruno, who, had he been by his side, might have kept off his scruples, but the oblate could not be found. Durtal sat down, disabled, dreaming of the sign he had asked for the evening before, endeavouring to throw off the recollection, thinking of it all the same. He wished to examine himself and collect himself, and he was praying heaven to forgive him his mental vacillations, when Monsieur Bruno came in, and went to kneel before the statue of the Virgin. Almost at the same minute a brother, who had a beard like seaweed growing from a face like a pear, took up to the altar of St. Joseph a small rustic table on which he placed a basin, a towel, 2 vases, and a napkin. Before these preparations, which recalled the imminence of the sacrifice, Durtal stiffened himself and succeeded by an effort in keeping back his anxieties and overthrowing his troubles, and escaping from himself, he ardently implored Our Lady to intervene so that he might, for this hour at least, without wandering, pray in peace. And when he had finished his prayer he lifted his eyes and looked with a start at the priest who was advancing, preceded by a lay brother, to celebrate Mass. This was not the curate whom he knew, but another, younger, very tall, with a majestic air, with cheeks pale and shaven, and a bald head. Durtal was watching him solemnly marching towards the altar with his eyes cast down, when he suddenly noticed a violet flame light up his fingers. "He wears an episcopal ring. He is a bishop," thought Durtal, who leant forward to see the colour of the vestment underneath the chasuble and alb. It was white. "Then it is a monk," he said, astounded, and mechanically he turned towards the statue of the Virgin, summoning the oblate by a hasty glance, who came to sit beside him. "Who is he?" "Dom Anselm, the abbot of the monastery." "He who was ill?" "Yes, he will give us communion." Durtal fell upon his knees, suffocated, almost trembling. He was not dreaming. Heaven was answering him by the sign on which he had fixed. He ought to abase himself before God, to be overwhelmed at his feet, to spread himself in a passion of gratitude. He knew and wished it, and without knowing how, he was exercising himself in seeking natural causes which might account for the substitution of a monk for the priest. No doubt it was very simple, for on the whole, before admitting a kind of miracle, "Anyhow, I will keep an open mind, for after the ceremony I wish to clear the matter up." And he repelled the insinuations which crept into him. Well, what interest could there be in the motive of this change? There clearly must be a motive, but it was only a consequence, an accessory, the important point was the supernatural will which had produced it. "In any case you have obtained more than you asked. You have even a better than the simple monk you wished for you have the abbot of La Trappe himself." And he cried, "Oh, to believe like these poor lay brothers, not to be endowed with a soul which is blown about by every wind, to have the faith of a child, an immovable faith, a faith which cannot be rooted up. Ah, Father, Father, bury it, rivet it in me." And such was his enthusiasm that he came out of himself. All around him seemed to disappear, and he cried, stammering, to Christ, "Lord, go not far from me. Let thy pity curb thy justice. Be unjust, forgive me. Receive thy poor beadsman for communion, the poor in spirit." Monsieur Bruno touched his arm, and with a glance invited him to accompany him. They went up to the altar and knelt upon the flagstones. Then, when the priest had blessed them, they knelt closer on the single step, and the lay brother handed them a napkin, for there was no bar or cloth. And the abbot of La Trappe gave them the communion. They returned to their places. Durtal was in a state of absolute torpor. The sacrament had, in a manner, anaesthetized his mind. He fell on his knees at his bench, incapable even of unravelling what might be moving within him, unable to rally and pull himself together. And all of a sudden the impression came over him that he was suffocating and wanted air. The Mass was finished. He rushed out and ran to his walk. There he wished to take an account of himself, and he found nothing. And in front of the cross-pond, in whose waters the Christ was drowning, there came over him an infinite melancholy, a vast sadness. It was a true syncope of the soul. It lost consciousness, and when it came to itself, he was astonished that he had not felt an unknown transport of joy. Then he dwelt on a troublesome recollection, on the all-too-human side of the deglutition of a god. The host had stuck against his palate, and he had had to seek it out with his tongue and roll it about like a pancake in order to swallow it. It was still too material. He only wanted a fluid, a perfume, a fire, or a breath. And he tried to explain to himself the treatment that the Saviour made him follow. All his anticipations had returned. It was the absolution and not the communion which had worked. When with the confessor he had very clearly perceived the presence of the Redeemer. All his being had, in a manner, been injected with divine effluvia, and the Eucharist had only brought him suffocation and trouble. It seemed that the effects of the two sacraments had changed places the one with the other. They had worked the wrong way with him. Christ had been perceptible to his soul before and not afterwards. But it is easy enough to see, he reflected, that the great question for me is to have an absolute certainty of my forgiveness. By a special favour, Jesus has ratified my faith in the healing power of penance. Why should he have done more? And then, what bounties would he reserve for his saints? After all, I am astonishing. It is too much that I should wish to be treated as he certainly treats Brother Anacletus and Brother Simeon. I have obtained more than I deserve, and what an answer I had this very morning. Yes, indeed, but why should such advances end suddenly in this recoil? And making his way towards the abbey to eat his bread and cheese, he said to himself, "My error towards God is to be always arguing when I ought to adore stupidly as these monks here do. To be able to keep silence to one's self, that is indeed a grace." He reached the refectory, which as a rule he had to himself, M. Bruno never coming to the meal at 7 o'clock in the morning. He was beginning to cut himself a piece of bread when the father guest-master appeared. He had a whetstone and some knives in his hand, and smiling at Durtal, he said, "I am going to polish the knives of the monastery, for they want it badly." And he placed them on a table in a small room attached to the refectory. "Well, are you satisfied?" he said, on coming back. "Certainly. But what happened this morning? How is it I was communicated by the abbot of La Trappe, when I should have been by the curate who dines with me?" "Ah," exclaimed the monk, "I was as much surprised as you. On waking, the father abbot suddenly declared that he must say Mass this morning. He got up in spite of the observations of the prior, who, as a doctor, forbade him to leave his bed. Neither I nor anyone else knows what took him. And they told him that a retreatant would communicate, and he answered, 'Just so, I shall communicate him.' And then M. Bruno took the opportunity of also approaching the sacrament, for he loves to receive our Saviour from the hands of Dom Anselm." "And this arrangement also satisfied the curate," the monk went on, smiling, "for he left La Trappe at an earlier hour this morning and has been able to say his Mass in a parish where he was expected. By the way, he told me to make his excuses to you for not having been able to bid you good-bye." Durtal bowed. "There is no doubt about it," he thought. "God wished to give me an unmistakable answer." "And your health?" "It is good, Father. I am astounded. My digestion has never been so good as it is here, to say nothing of the fact that the neuralgia, which I feared so much, has spared me." "That shows that Heaven protects you." "Yes, indeed. But now that I remember it, I have long wished to ask you this. How are your offices arranged? They do not correspond with those printed in my prayer book." "No, they differ from yours, which belong to the Roman ritual. At the same time, the Vespers are almost similar, except sometimes the lessons, and then what may put you out is that ours are often preceded by the Vespers of the Blessed Virgin. As a general rule, we have a psalm less in the office, and the lessons are nearly always short. Except, Father Etienne went on, smiling, in Compline, the very one you recite. Thus you may have noticed we know nothing of In manus tuas, Domine, which is one of the few short lessons sung in parish churches. We also have a special proper of saints. We celebrate the commemoration of the blessed of our order, which you will not find in your books. In fact, we follow the letter of the monastic breviary of Saint Benedict. Durtal had finished his breakfast. He rose, fearing to trouble the father by his questions. One word of the monk, however, was troubling his brain, that relating to the prior as a doctor. And before going out, he spoke of this again to Father Etienne. No, the Reverend Father Maximin is not a doctor, but he understands simples very well, and he has a small pharmacy which is enough as long as no one is seriously ill. And in that case? In that case the practitioner can be called in from one of the nearest towns, but no one is ever so ill as that, or else the end is approaching and the doctor's visit would be useless. So on the whole the prior looks after soul and body at La Trappe. The monk signified assent. Durtal went out. He hoped to get rid of his suffocation by a long walk. He took a road which he had not been along before, and came out on a glade where stood the ruins of an ancient convent, some bits of wall, truncated columns and capitals in the Roman style. Unhappily, these remains were in a deplorable condition, rough, covered with moss and riddled with holes like pumice stones. He went on and came to the end of a long walk, at the top of which was a pond 5 or 6 times as large as the small one in the form of a cross, which he frequented. The walk was planted with old oaks on each side, and in the middle, near a wooden bench, stood a cast-iron statue of the Virgin. He groaned as he looked at it. The crime of the Church followed him once more. Even in this little chapel, so full of divine compassion, all the statues came from the religious bazaars of Paris or Lyons. He took his position below, near the pond whose banks were bordered by reeds surrounded by tufts of osiers, and he amused himself by examining the colours of these shrubs, with their smooth green leaves and stalks of citron yellow or blood red, noticing the curling water which began to foam with a gust of wind. And the martins skimmed it, touching it with the tips of their wings from which drops of water fell like pearls of quicksilver. And the birds rose whirling above and giving out their cries of wheat, 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 while the dragonflies shone brightly in the air which they slashed with blue flames. Peaceful refuge, thought Durtal. I ought to have come to rest here before. He sat down on a bed of moss and interested himself in the noiseless and active life of the waters. Now the splash and flash of the turn of a leaping carp, now great spiders skating on the surface, making little circles and driving one against another, stopping, going back and making new rounds. Then near him on the ground Durtal noticed jumping green grasshoppers with vermilion bellies, or scaling the oaks colonies of queer insects on whose backs a devil's head was painted in red lead on a black ground. And above all that, if he raised his eyes, there was the silent upturned sea of heaven, a blue sea crested with surging white clouds like waves, and at the same time this firmament moved in the water where it billowed under a bluish-grey glass. Durtal felt himself expand as he smoked cigarettes. The melancholy which had oppressed him since the dawn began to melt away, and joy crept into him as he felt his soul was washed in the pool of the sacraments and dried in the air of a cloister. And he was at once happy and uneasy. Happy, for the meeting he had had with the Father Guest-master had removed all the doubts he had entertained as to the supernatural side to the sudden change of a priest for a monk to communicate him. Happy also to know that not only had Christ not repulsed him in spite of all the disorders of his life, but that he was encouraging him and giving him pledges, ratifying the signs of his favours by perceptible acts. And nevertheless he was uneasy, for he knew himself to be barren, and felt that it was necessary for him to be grateful for this goodness by a struggle with himself and an entirely new existence differing completely from that he had hitherto led. Well, we shall see. And he went off to the office of sext, almost calmed, and thence to dinner, where he found M. Bruno. "We will go for a walk to-day," said the oblate, rubbing his hands. Durtal looked at him with astonishment. "Yes, indeed, I thought that after communion a little air outside the walls would do you good, and I proposed to the Reverend Father Abbot to free you from the rule for to-day, if the offer is not disagreeable to you." "I gladly accept, and thank you sincerely for your kind attention," said Durtal. They dined off a soup made with oil in which a stick of cabbage and some peas were swimming. It was not bad, but the bread made at La Trappe reminded him, when stale, of the bread in the siege of Paris, and made the soup turn sour. Then they tasted an egg with sorrel and some rice steeped in milk. "If it suits you," said the oblate, "we will begin by paying a visit to Dom Anselm, who has expressed a wish to know you." And M. Bruno led Durtal through a labyrinth of passages and staircases, to a small cell where the abbot was. He was dressed like the fathers in a white robe and a black scapular. Only at the end of a violet cord he bore on his breast an abbot's cross of ivory, in the centre of which, under a round glass, some relics were inserted. He gave his hand to Durtal and begged him to sit down. Then he asked if the food seemed to be enough for him, and on receiving a reply in the affirmative from Durtal, he inquired if the long silence did not weigh upon him too much. "Not at all, this solitude suits me perfectly." "Well," said the abbot, laughing, "you are one of the few laymen who have borne our rule so easily. Generally, those who have tried to make a retreat here have been devoured by homesickness and spleen, and have had but one idea, to get away. Let us see," he said after a pause, "it is not possible, all the same, that such a sudden change of habits should not bring with it some painful privations. There must be at least one which you feel above all the others." "True. I feel the want of being able to light a cigarette whenever I like." The abbot answered, smiling, "But I suppose you have not been entirely without smoking since you came here?" "I should tell a lie if I said I had not smoked in secret." "Why, bless me, tobacco was not foreseen by Saint Benedict. There is no mention of it in his rule, and I am therefore free to allow its use. So smoke as many cigarettes as you like, without being uneasy." And Dom Anselm added, "I hope shortly to have a little more time to myself, unless, indeed, I am obliged to keep my room. In that case I shall be happy to have a longer talk with you." And the monk, who seemed exhausted, shook them by the hand. Going down into the court with the oblate, Durtal exclaimed, "The Father Abbot is charming, and quite young." "He is hardly 40. "He appears to be really ill."
"Yes, he is not well, and he required no common energy to say his mass this morning. But let us see, we will first of all visit the grounds of La Trappe, which you can hardly have been over completely. Then we will leave the enclosure and push on to the farm."
They started, skirting the remains of the ancient abbey, and as they walked, turning by the piece of water near which Durtal had been seated in the morning, M. Bruno entered into explanations about the ruins.
"This monastery was founded in 1127 by Saint Bernard, who installed the blessed Humbert as abbot, an epileptic Cistercian, whom he had cured by a miracle. At that time there were apparitions in the convent. A legend relates that 2 angels came and cut one of the lilies planted in the cemetery every time one of the monks died. The second abbot was the blessed Guéric, who was famous for his knowledge, his humility, and his patience in enduring evils. We possess his relics, and they are enclosed in the shrine under the high altar. But the most remarkable of the superiors, who succeeded each other here in the Middle Ages, was Peter Monoculus, whose story was written by his friend, the member of the synod, Thomas de Reims. Pierre, called Monoculus, or the One Eye, was a saint thirsting for austerities and sufferings. He was assailed by horrible temptations at which he laughed. Exasperated, the devil attacked his body, and by fits of neuralgia broke his skull, but heaven came to his aid and cured it. By shedding tears from a spirit of penitence, Peter lost an eye, and he thanked our Lord for this blessing. "I had," he said, "2 enemies. I have escaped the first, but the one I retain troubles me more than the one I have lost." He worked miracles of healing. The King of France, Louis VII, venerated him so much that on seeing the empty eyelid he wished to kiss it. Monoculus died in 1186. They soaked linen cloths in his blood, and washed his entrails in wine, which was distributed, for the mixture was a powerful remedy. The property of the abbey was then immense. It comprised all the country which surrounds us, kept up several lazar houses in the neighbourhood, and was the home of more than 300 monks. Unfortunately, what happened to others happened to Notre Dame de l'Atre. Under the rule of abbots in commendam it declined, and it was dying with only 6 religious to look after it when the Revolution suppressed it. The church was then pulled down and afterwards replaced by the Rotunda chapel. Only in 1875 the present house, which I think dates from 1733, was reconciled and became a monastery again. Trappists were brought here from Sainte-Marie-de-la-Mer in the diocese of Toulouse, and this small colony has made Notre-Dame-de-l'Âtre the Cistercian nursery you see. Such, in few words, is the history of the convent, said the oblate. As for the ruins, they are buried underground, and no doubt precious fragments might be discovered, but for want of money and men no excavations have been made. In addition to the broken columns and the capitals we passed, there remains from the old church a large statue of the Virgin, which has been erected in one of the corridors of the abbey. Besides this, there are 2 angels fairly well preserved, and which you may see down there at the end of the cloister in a small chapel, hidden behind a curtain of trees. A Virgin, before which Saint Bernard may possibly have knelt, ought surely to have been put in the church on the altar dedicated to Mary, for the coloured statue which surmounts it is of crying ugliness. Like that one also, said Durtal, pointing out in the distance the cast-iron Madonna which towered above the pond. The oblate bowed his head and did not reply. "Do you know," exclaimed Durtal, who in the face of this silence did not persist and changed the conversation, "do you know that I envy you living here? It is certain that I do not deserve this favour, for on the whole the cloister is less an expiation than a reward. It is the only place where, far from the world and near heaven, the only place where a man may give himself up to this mystic life which only develops in solitude and silence. Yes, and if possible I envy you yet more that you should have had the courage to venture into regions which I confess frightened me. And I know so well that, in spite of the springboard of prayers and fasts, in spite of the greenhouse or orchid-house atmosphere, wherein mysticism is grown, I should wither away in these regions without ever expanding again." The oblate smiled. "What do you know about it?" he replied. "The thing is not done in an hour. The orchid you speak of does not flower in a day. The advance is so slow that mortifications space themselves out, fatigues are distributed over years, and on the whole are easily borne. As a general rule it is necessary, to cross the distance which separates us from the Creator, to go through 3 grades to attain that science of Christian perfection which is called mysticism. We must live in turn the life of purification, of illumination, and of unity, to join the uncreated good and be poured out in Him. It matters little that these 3 grand phases of ascetic existence subdivide themselves into an infinity of stages, which are degrees according to Saint Bonaventure, dwelling places according to Saint Teresa, steps according to Saint Angela. They may vary in length and number according to the will of the Lord and the temperament of those who go through them. It is not disputed that the journey of the soul towards God includes, first, perpendicular and breakneck roads. These are the roads of the life of purification. Next, narrower paths still, but well marked out and accessible. These are the paths of the life of illumination. At length a wide road, almost smooth, the road of the life of unity, at the end of which the soul throws itself into the furnace of love, and falls into the abyss of the most adorable infinity. On the whole, these 3 ways are successively reserved to those who start in Christian asceticism, to those who practice it, and finally to those who attain to the supreme end, the death of self and the life in God. "Long," pursued the oblate, "I have placed my desires beyond the horizon, yet I progress little. I am scarcely disengaged from the life of purification, scarcely, and you do not fear, how shall I say, material infirmities, for if at last you succeed in attaining the limits of contemplation, you risk the ruin of your body forever. Experience seems to show, in effect, that the deified soul acts on the constitution and brings incurable troubles." The oblate smiled. "In the first place, I should no doubt fail to attain to the last degree of initiation, the extreme point of mysticism. Then, supposing I attain it, what would corporal accidents be in the face of such results? Let me also assure you that these accidents are neither so frequent nor so certain as you seem to think. A man may be a great mystic or an admirable saint, and not be the subject of visible phenomena for those who surround him. Would you not think, for example, that levitation, or the flight of bodies in the air, which seems to constitute the highest state of rapture, is one of the rarest? Whom can you quote to me? Saint Teresa, Saint Christina the Admirable, Saint Peter of Alcantara, Dominic of Mary Jesus, Agnes of Bohemia, Margaret of the Blessed Sacrament, the Blessed Gorardesca of Pisa, and above all Saint Joseph of Cupertino, who raised himself at will from the ground. But they are 10 or 20 out of thousands of the elect. And note well that these gifts do not prove their superiority over other saints. Saint Teresa declares expressly, "It must not be imagined that any one, blessed as he may be in this respect, is better than those who are not so blessed, for our Lord directs each one according to his particular need." And then the doctrine of the Church is seen in the untiring prudence shown in the canonization of the dead. Qualities and not extraordinary acts decide this. For the Church, miracles themselves are only secondary proofs, for she knows that the spirit of evil imitates them. In the lives of the blessed you will find, too, the most unusual deeds, and more amazing phenomena than in the biographies of the saints. These phenomena have rather hindered than helped them. After having beatified them for their virtues, the Church has put off, and no doubt for a long time, their promotion to the sovereign dignity of saints. It is difficult, on the whole, to formulate an exact theory on this subject, for if the mental action is the same in all mystics, it differs a little, as I have said, according to God's will and the character of the subjects. The difference of sex often changes the form of the mystic flow, though in essence it never varies. The rush of the spirit from on high may produce different effects, but is none the less identical. The only observation we dare make in these matters is that women, as a rule, are more passive and less reserved, while men resist more violently the wishes of heaven. "That makes me think," said Durtal, "that even in religion there are souls which seem to have mistaken their sex. St. Francis of Assisi, who was all love, had rather the feminine soul of a nun, and St. Teresa, who was the most attentive of psychologists, had the virile soul of a monk. We might correctly speak of St. Francis as a woman and St. Teresa as a man." The oblate smiled. "To return to your question," he resumed, "I do not at all believe that illness can be the necessary consequence of phenomena aroused by the impetuous force of mysticism. But look at Saint Colette, Lidwine, Saint Aldegonde, Jane Mary of the Cross, Sister Emmerich, and how many more who passed their existence half paralyzed upon a bed? They are a small minority. Besides, the saints or blessed ones whose names you quote were victims of substitution, expiating the sins of others, a part God had reserved to them. It is not therefore surprising that they were bedridden and cripples, and were constantly half dead. No, the truth is that mysticism can modify the needs of the body, without, for all that, having so much effect on, or destroying the health. I know well you would answer me with that terrible phrase of Saint Hildegard, a phrase at once just and sinister. The Lord dwells not in the bodies of the healthy and vigorous. And you might add, with Saint Teresa, that evils are more frequent in the last of the castles of the soul. Yes, but these saints hoist themselves on the summit of life and retain God in a permanent manner in their carnal shell. Having reached this point, nature, too feeble to support a perfect state, gives way. But I assert again, these cases are an exception and not a rule. And alas, such maladies are not contagious. I am quite aware, resumed the oblate after a pause, that the very existence of mysticism is resolutely denied by some who in consequence can never admit the possibility of any influence over the bodily organs, but the experience of this supernatural reality is from all time, and proofs abound. Let us take the stomach, for example. Well, under the heavenly influence it becomes transformed, omits all earthly nourishment, and consumes the holy species only. St. Catherine of Siena and Angela of Foligno lived for years exclusively on the sacrament, and this gift devolved equally upon Saint Colette, Saint Lidwine, Dominique of Paradise, Saint Columba of Rieti, Mary Bagnesi, Rose of Lima, Saint Peter of Alcantara, Mother Agnès of Langeac, and on many others. Under the divine impress the senses of smell and taste presented no less strange metamorphoses. St. Philip Neri, St. Angela, St. Margaret of Cortona recognized a special taste in unleavened bread, when after the consecration there was no longer any wheat, but the very flesh of Christ. St. Pachomius knew heretics by their foul smell. St. Catherine of Siena, St. Joseph of Cupertino, and Mother Agnes of Jesus discovered sins by their evil odours. St. Hilarion, St. Lutgard, Gentilla of Ravenna could tell merely by the scent of those whom they met what faults they had committed. And the saints themselves, whether living or dead, exhaled powerful perfumes. When Saint Francis de Paul and Venturini of Bergamo offered the sacrifice, they smelt sweet. St. Joseph of Cupertino secreted such fragrant odours that his track could be followed, and sometimes it was during illness that these aromas were diffused. The Pass of St. John of the Cross and of the blessed Didet gave forth strong and distinct scent of lilies. Bartol, the tertiary, gnawed to the bones by leprosy, gave out pleasant emanations, and the same was the case with Lidwine, Ida of Louvain, Saint Colette, Saint Humiliana, Maria Victoria of Genoa, Dominique of Paradise, whose wounds were boxes of perfume, whence fresh scents escaped. And thus we can enumerate organs and senses one after another and declare marvellous effects. Without speaking of those faithful stigmata which open or shut according to the proper of the liturgical year, what is more astounding than the gift of bilocation, the power of doubling oneself, of being in two places at the same time, at the same moment? And yet what numerous examples exist of this incredible fact! Many are celebrated, amongst others those of St. Anthony of Padua, St. Francis Xavier, Marie of Agreda, who was at the same time in her monastery in Spain and in Mexico when she was preaching to infidels, Mother Agnes of Jesus, who came to visit Monsieur Ollier at Paris without leaving her convent at Langeac. And again the action from on high seems singularly energetic when it takes hold of the central organ of circulation, the motor which drives the blood into all parts of the body. Numbers of the elect had such a burning heart that the linen they wore was singed. The fire which consumed Ursula Benincasa, the foundress of the Theatines, was so strong that this saint breathed columns of smoke as soon as she opened her mouth. St. Catherine of Genoa dipped her feet or her hands in iced water and the water boiled. Snow melted round St. Peter of Alcantara, and one day when the blessed Gerlach was crossing a forest in the depth of winter, he advised his companion who walked behind him, and who could not go on, as his legs were numb, to put his feet into his footsteps, and immediately he ceased to feel cold. I will add that certain of these phenomena which make freethinkers smile have been renewed and have been verified quite recently. Linen scorched by the fire of the heart has been observed by Dr. Imbert Gourbert on the stigmatized Palma d'Oria, and phenomena of high mysticism, which no science can explain, were watched in the case of Louis Lateau, minute by minute, and noted and controlled by Professor Rohling, Dr. Lafebvre, Dr. Imbert Gourbert, Dr. de Noyeux, by medical delegates from all countries. "But here we are," said the oblate. "Excuse me, I will go first to show you the way." They had left the enclosure as he spoke, and cutting across the fields, reached an immense farm. Trappists bowed respectfully as they entered the courtyard. Monsieur Bruno, addressing himself to one of them, asked him to be good enough to take them over the property. The lay brother took them to the cattle sheds, then to the stables, then to the poultry yard. Durtal, who was not interested in such sights, confined himself to admiring the grace of these good people. No one spoke, but they replied to questions by signs and winks. "But how do they communicate with each other?" asked Durtal when they were outside the farm. "You have just seen, they correspond by signs. They have a simpler alphabet than that of the deaf and dumb, for each idea that they may require to express for their common work is foreseen. Thus the word wash is translated by one hand tapping on the other, the word vegetable by scratching the left forefinger. Sleep is feigned by leaning the head upon the fist, drink by raising a closed hand to the lips. And for more spiritual expressions they employ a like method. Confession is translated by a finger kissed and laid upon the heart. Holy water by 5 fingers of the left hand clasped, on which a cross is made with the thumb of the right hand. Fasting by fingers which close the mouth. The word yesterday by turning the arm back towards the shoulder. Shame by covering the eyes with the hand. But supposing they wished to indicate me, who am not one of themselves, how would they set about it? They would use the sign of guest, which they make by stretching out the hand and bringing it near the body. That means that I come to them from far, an open and even transparent fact, if you like. They went silently along a walk which led down into the labour fields. "I have not noticed Brother Anacletus or old Simeon among these monks," exclaimed Durtal suddenly. "They are not occupied on the farm. Brother Anacletus is employed in the chocolate factory, and Brother Simeon looks after the pigs. Both are working in the immediate neighbourhood of the monastery. If you like, we will go and wish Simeon good morning." And the oblate added, "You can tell them, when you go back to Paris, that you have seen a real saint, such as existed in the 11th century. He carries us back to the time of St. Francis of Assisi. He is in some sense the reincarnation of that astonishing juniper whose innocent exploits the Fioretti celebrate for us. You know that work?" "Yes, after the Golden Legend it is the book on which the soul of the Middle Ages is most clearly impressed. But to return to Simeon, this old man is a saint of uncommon simplicity. Here is one proof out of 1,000. Several months ago I was in the prior's cell when Brother Simeon appeared. He made use of the ordinary formula in asking permission to speak. Benedicite. Father Maximin replied Dominus, and on this word, which permitted him to speak, the brother showed his glasses and said he could no longer see clearly. That is not very surprising, said the prior. You have been using the same glasses for nearly 10 years, and since then your eyes may well have become weaker. Never mind, we will find the number which suits your sight now. As he spoke, Father Maximin mechanically moved the glass of the spectacles between his hands, and suddenly he laughed, showing me his fingers, which were black. He turned round, took a cloth, cleaned the spectacles, and replacing them on the brother's nose, said to him, "Do you see, Brother Simeon?" And the old man, astonished, cried, "Yes, I see." But this is only one side of this good man. Another is the love of his beasts. When a sow is going to bring forth, he asks permission to pass the night by her, and delivers her, looking after her like his child, weeps when they sell his little pigs or when the big ones are sent to the slaughter-house. And how all the animals adore him! Truly, the oblate went on after a silence, God loves simple souls above all, for he loads Brother Simeon with graces. Alone here he can reabsorb and even prevent the demoniacal accidents which arise in cloisters. Then we assist at strange performances. One fine morning all the pigs fall on their sides. They are ill and at the point of death. Simeon, who knows the origin of these evils, cries to the devil, "Wait, wait, and you will see." He runs for holy water and sprinkles them with it, praying the while, and all the beasts who are dying jump up, frisking about and wagging their tails. As for diabolic incursions into the convent itself, they are but too real, and sometimes are only driven back after persistent prayers and energetic fastings. At certain times in most convents the demon sows a harvest of hobgoblins of whom no one knows how to get rid. Here the father abbot, the prior, and all those who are priests have failed. It was necessary, to give efficacy to the exorcisms, that the humble lay brother should intervene. So to forestall new attacks he has obtained the right to wash the monastery with holy water and to use prayers whenever he thinks well to do so. He has the power of feeling where the evil one is hidden, and he follows him, tracks him, and finally casts him out. Here is the piggery, continued M. Bruno, showing a tumble-down old place in front of the left wing of the cloister, surrounded by palisades, and he added, "I warn you, the old man grunts like a pig, but he will not answer your questions except by signs." "But he can speak to his animals?" "Yes, to them only." The oblate opened a small door, and the lay brother, all bent, lifted his head with difficulty. "Good day, brother," said M. Bruno. "Here is a gentleman who would like to see your pupils." There was a grunt of joy on the lips of the old man. He smiled and invited them by a sign to follow him. He introduced them into a shed, and Durtal recoiled, deafened by horrible cries, suffocated by the pestilential heat of the liquid manure. All the pigs jumped up behind their barrier, and howled with joy at the sight of the brother. "Peace, peace," said the old man in a gentle voice, and lifting an arm over the paling, he caressed the snouts which, on smelling him, were almost suffocated by grunting. He drew Durtal aside by the arm, and making him lean over the trellis work, showed him an enormous sow with a snub nose, of English breed, a monstrous animal surrounded by a company of sucking pigs which rushed, as if mad, at her teats. "Yes, my beauty, go, my beauty," murmured the old man, stroking her bristles with his hand. And the sow looked at him with little languishing eyes, and licked his fingers. She ended by screaming abominably when he went away. And Brother Simeon showed off other pupils, pigs with ears like the mouth of a trumpet and corkscrew tails, sows whose stomachs trailed and whose feet seemed hardly outside their bodies, newborn pigs which sucked ravenously at the teats, larger ones who delighted in chasing each other about and rolled in the mud, snorting. Durtal complimented him on the beasts, and the old man was jubilant, wiping his face with his great hand. Then, on the oblate inquiring about the litter of some sow, he felt his fingers in a row, replying to the observation that the animals were very greedy, by stretching his arms to heaven, showing the empty troughs, lifting ends of wood, tearing up tufts of grass which he carried to his lips, grunting as if he had his muzzle full. Then he took them into the courtyard, placed them against the wall, opened a door beyond, and hid himself. A formidable boar passed like a waterspout, upset a wheelbarrow, scattering everything around him with a noise like a shell bursting. Then he broke into a gallop all round the courtyard, and ended by taking a header into a sea of liquid manure. He wallowed, turned head over heels, kicked about with his 4 feet in the air, and got up black and disgusting as the inside of a chimney. After this he halted, grunted a cheerful note, and wished to fawn on the monk, who checked him with a gesture. "Your boar is splendid," said Durtal. And the lay brother looked on Durtal with moist eyes as he rubbed his neck with his hand, sighing. "That means they are going to kill him soon," said the oblate. And the old man acquiesced with a melancholy shake of his head. They left him, thanking him for his kindness. "When I think of how this being, who is devoted to the lowest duties, prays in church, I long to kneel before him and, like his pigs, kiss his hands," exclaimed Durtal after a silence. "Brother Simeon is an angelic being," replied the oblate. "He lives the unitive life, his soul plunged, drowned in the divine essence. Under a rough exterior, an absolutely white soul, a soul without sin, lives in this poor body. It is right that God should spoil him. As I have told you, he has given him all power over the demon, and in certain cases he allows him also the power of healing by the imposition of hands. He has renewed here the wonderful cures of the ancient saints." They ceased speaking, and warned by the bells which were ringing for vespers, they moved towards the church. And coming to himself again, trying to recover, Durtal remained astounded. Monastic life retarded time. How many weeks had he been at La Trappe, and how many days since he had approached the sacraments? That was lost in the distance. Life was double in these cloisters, and yet he was not tired of it. He had bent himself easily to the hard rule, and in spite of the scanty meals, he felt no sick headaches or failing. He had never felt so well. But what remained was a feeling of stifling, of restrained sighs, this burning melancholy for hours, and more than all, this vague anxiety at listening again within himself, and hearing united in his person the voices of this Trinity, God, the Devil, and man. "This is not the peace of soul I dreamed of, and it is even worse than at Paris," he said to himself, recalling the maddening trial of the Rosary. "And yet, how can I explain it? I am happy here all the same." End of Part 2, Chapter 4.
Part 2, Chapter 5 of En route by Joris-Karl HUYSMANS, translated by Charles Kegan Paul. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Rising, somewhat earlier than his wont, Durtal went down to the chapel. The office of matins was over, but some lay brothers, amongst whom was Brother Simeon, were praying on their knees on the ground. The sight of this holy swineherd threw Durtal into a long train of thought. He tried in vain to penetrate into the sanctuary of that soul, hidden like an invisible chapel behind the dunghill rampart of a body. He did not even succeed in representing to himself the docile and clinging soul of this man, who had attained the highest state to which the human creature can reach here below. "What a power of prayer he has," thought he, as he looked at the old man. He remembered the details of his interview the evening before. "It is true," he thought, "that in this monk I find something of the charm of that brother Juniper, whose surprising simplicity has come down through the ages." And he brought to mind the adventures of that Franciscan whom his companions left one day by himself in the convent, telling him to prepare dinner against their return. Juniper reflected, "What an amount of time is spent in preparing food! The brothers who take turns in that work have not even time to pray." And desiring to lighten the work of those who should succeed him in the kitchen, he determined to cook such plentiful dishes that the community might dine on them for a fortnight. He lighted all the stoves, procured, we are not told how, enormous boilers, filled them with water, threw into them, pell-mell, eggs with their shells, chickens with their feathers, vegetables he had neglected to trim, and before a fire which would roast an ox, he exerted himself to pile up and stir the ridiculous jumble of his stock-pots. When the brothers came home and sat down in the refectory, he ran, his face browned and his hands burnt, and joyously served up his stew. The superior asked him if he were not mad, while he remained stupefied that no one gobbled up this astonishing mess. He declared in all humility that he thought he was doing a service to his brethren,
and only when he observed that so much food would be wasted did he weep hot tears and declare himself a wretch. He cried that he was good for nothing but to spoil the property of Almighty God, while the monks smiled, admiring this debauch of charity and the excess of Juniper's simplicity. Brother Simeon would be humble enough and simple enough to renew again such splendid jokes, thought Durtal, but better still than the good Franciscan, he recalls the memory of that astonishing St. Joseph of Cupertino, of whom the oblate spoke yesterday. He, who called himself Brother Ass, was a charming and poor creature, so modest and so ignorant that he was turned away wherever he went. He passed through life, with open mouth, thrusting himself eagerly against all the cloisters that repulsed him. He wandered about unable to perform even the lowest tasks. He was, to use a popular expression, a regular butterfingers, and broke whatever he touched. They ordered him to go and fetch water, and he wandered without understanding, absorbed in God, and at the end, when no one thought about it any more, brought some after a month. A monastery of Capucins, which had received him, got rid of him. He went his way, vaguely, out of his orbit among the towns, stumbled into another convent where he employed himself in taking care of the animals, whom he adored, and he rose into a perpetual ecstasy, revealing himself as the most singular of wonder-workers, putting the demons to flight and healing the sick. He was at once idiotic and sublime. In the hagiography he stands alone, and seems to figure there to furnish a proof that the soul is identified with eternal wisdom, rather by ignorance than by science. "He also loves animals," said Durtal to himself as he looked at old Simeon, "and he too puts to flight the evil one, and works cures by his sanctity. In a time when all men are exclusively haunted by the thoughts of luxury and lucre, the soul appears extraordinary when divested of its bark, as the candid and naked soul of this good monk. He is 80 years old and more, and he has led from his youth up the restricted life of the Trappists. He probably does not know in what time he lives, nor what latitudes he inhabits, whether he is in America or in France, for he has never read a newspaper, and outside rumours do not reach him. He does not even know the taste of flesh meat or wine. He has no notion of money, of which he does not suspect the value nor the appearance. He does not imagine how a woman is made. And save for the breeding of his pigs, he perhaps cannot even guess the meaning and the consequences of the sin of the flesh. He lives alone, ringed round by silence, and buried in the shade. He meditates on the mortifications of the fathers in the desert, which are read to him as he eats, and the frenzy of their fasts makes him ashamed of his miserable repast, and he accuses himself that he is so well to do. Ah, this Father Simeon is innocent. He knows nothing that we know, and knows that of which all others are ignorant. His education has been taken in hand by the Lord himself, who teaches him truths which we cannot comprehend, models his soul after heaven, infuses himself into him, possesses him, and deifies him in the union of blessedness. This puts us somewhat at a distance from hypocrites and devout persons, as far indeed as modern Catholicism is from mysticism, for certainly that religion is as grovelling on the ground as mysticism is high. And that is true. Instead of directing all our forces to that unknown end, of taking our soul to fashion it in that form of a dove which the Middle Ages gave to the pyxes, instead of making it the shrine where the host reposes in the very image of the Holy Spirit, the Catholic confines himself to trying to conceal his conscience, to deceive his judge by the fear of a salutary hell. He acts not by choice, but by fear. He, with the aid of his clergy, and the help of his imbecile literature, and his feeble press, has made of religion a mere fetishism, a ridiculous worship composed of statuettes and alms-boxes, candles and chromolithographs. He has materialized the ideal of love in inventing an entirely physical devotion to the Sacred Heart. What baseness of conception, continued Durtal, who had come out of the chapel and was strolling along the bank of the great pond. He looked at the reeds, which bent like an harvest still green under a puff of wind. Then he half saw, as he leant forward, an old boat, which bore almost effaced on its bluish hull the name Alleluia. This bark disappeared under the tufts of leaves round which were twined the bells of the convolvulus, a symbolic flower, since it widens out like a chalice, and has the dead white of a wafer. The scent of the water, at once enticing and bitter, intoxicated him. "Ah," he thought, "happiness certainly consists in being restricted to a place closely locked, a prison very confined, or a chapel always open." And he caught himself up. "Ah, there is Brother Anacletus!" The lay brother was coming towards him, bending under a hamper. He passed before Durtal, smiling at him with his eyes, and while he went his way, Durtal thought, "This man is a true friend of mine. When I was suffering so much before my confession, he expressed all to me in a look. Today, when he believes me serener and more joyous, he is content, and shows it to me by a smile. And I shall never speak to him, I shall never thank him, I shall never even know who he is, I shall perhaps never even see him again. In leaving this place I shall keep a friend, for whom I too feel affection. Yet neither of us has even exchanged a gesture with the other." "After all," he thought, "does not this absolute reserve make our friendship more perfect? It is stamped in the eternal distance, it remains mysterious and incomplete, and more certain." While thinking over these reflections, Durtal went towards the chapel, where the office called him, and thence to the refectory. He was surprised to find the table laid only for one. "What has happened to Monsieur Bruno? Yet I may as well wait a while." And to kill time he occupied himself by reading a printed card hung upon the wall. It was a sort of advertisement which began thus: "Eternity. Fellow sinners, you will die. Be ye always ready. Watch then, pray without ceasing, never forget the 4 last things which you see here traced. Death, the gate of eternity. Judgment, which decides eternity. Hell, the abode of unhappy eternity. Paradise, the abode of blessed eternity." Father Etienne interrupted Durtal, telling him that M. Bruno had gone to Saint-Landry to make some purchases, and would only return at bedtime at 8 o'clock. "Dine then without waiting, and make haste, or all your dishes will be cold." "And how is the Father Abbot?" "Better, he keeps his room still, but he hopes to be able to come down a while, the day after tomorrow, and assist at least at some of the offices." And the monk bowed and disappeared. Durtal seated himself at table, ate some bean broth, swallowed a soft-boiled egg and a spoonful of warm beans, then once outside, he passed along the chapel, entered it, and knelt before the altar of the Virgin. But at once the spirit of blasphemy filled him. He wished, whatever it cost him, to insult the Virgin. It seemed to him that he would experience a sharp joy, an acute pleasure in soiling her. But he restrained himself, he wrinkled his face not to allow the coal-heaver's abuse, which was on his lips, to escape. And he detested these abominations, he revolted against them, strove against them with horror, and the impulse became so irresistible that in order to keep silence he was obliged to bite his lips till they bled. "This is somewhat strong," he said, "to hear grumbling in oneself the contrary of what one is thinking." But he had need to call to his help all his will, he felt that he should yield and spit out all these impurities, wherefore he fled, thinking that should he find no means of resistance, it were better to vomit this filth in the court rather than in the church. And so soon as he quitted the chapel this madness of blasphemy ceased. He walked along the pond astonished by the strange violence of the attack. Little by little there came to him the unexplained intuition of a danger that menaced him. As a beast that scents a hidden enemy, he looked with precaution within himself, and ended by seeing a black point on the horizon of his soul, and suddenly, before he had time to reconnoitre, and take account of the danger he saw arising, this point extended and covered him with its shadow. There was no more light in him. He had that minute of unrest which precedes the storm, and in the anxious silence of his being, arguments fell like drops of rain. The painful effects of the sacrament justified themselves, had he not proceeded in such a way that his communion could not but be unfaithful. Evidently, instead of collecting and straining himself, he had passed an afternoon of revolt and anger. The very evening before he had unworthily judged an ecclesiastic whose only wrong was that he took pleasure in the vanity of easy jokes. Had he confessed this injustice and these revolts? Not the least in the world, and after the communion still less. Had he, as he should have done, shut himself up alone with his guest? He had abandoned him, without thinking more of him, had quitted his innermost cell, had taken a walk in the wood, had not even been present at the offices. But come, this blame is foolish. I communicated, just as I was, on the formal order of the confessor. As for the walk, I did not ask for it nor wish for it. M. Bruno, in agreement with the abbot of La Trappe, decided it would do me good. I have then nothing to reproach myself with. I am blameless. This does not prove that you would not have done better to spend the day in prayer in the church." "But," he cried, "with such a system one could not move, one could not eat nor sleep, for one should never leave the church. There must be time for everything, or the devil take it all." No doubt, but a more diligent soul would have refused that excursion just because it was pleasant, would have avoided it out of mortification in a spirit of penance. "Evidently, but—" These scruples tortured him. "The fact is," he said, "I might have employed my afternoon more wholesomely than that." To believe that he had spent it ill was but a step, and he made it. He pelted himself for an hour, sweating with agony, heaping on himself imaginary sins, and entering so far on that road that he ended by suddenly realizing his position and understanding he was out of the right track. The story of the rosary returned to his memory, and then he blamed himself for allowing himself to be again driven into a corner by the demon. He began to breathe again, to regain his footing, when other attacks equally formidable presented themselves. It was no longer an insinuation of arguments which ran drop by drop, but a furious rain which threw itself like an avalanche on his soul. The storm, of which the wave of scruples was only the prelude, burst in its fullness. And in the panic of the first moment, in the violence of the tempest, the enemy unmasked his batteries and struck him to the heart. He had got no good from that communion, but he was also too young at it. Ah, indeed was he to believe that because a priest uttered 5 Latin words over a bit of unleavened bread, that bread was transubstantiated into the flesh of Christ? That a child should accept such nonsense might be possible, but that a man past 40 should listen to such formidable shams was excessive, almost disquieting. And these insinuations lashed him like hail showers. How could bread made of wheat before have only the appearance of wheat afterwards? What is flesh that is neither seen nor felt? What is a body which has such ubiquity as to be at the same time on the altars of diverse countries? What is that power which is annihilated when the host is not made of pure wheat? And this became a regular deluge which overwhelmed him, and yet like an impenetrable pile, that faith he had acquired without ever having known how, remained immovable, disappeared under torrents of interrogation, but never stirred. He revolted and said to himself, "This only proves that the sacramental darkness of the Eucharist cannot be sounded. Moreover, if it were intelligible, it would not be divine. If the God whom we serve could be comprehended by reason, he could not be worth the trouble of serving," said Tauler. And the Imitation declares plainly also at the end of the 4th book, that if the works of God were such as man's intelligence could easily grasp, they would cease to be marvellous, and could not be qualified as ineffable. And a mocking voice replied, "That is what you call answering, avowing that there is nothing to answer." "In fact," said Durtal, who reflected, "I have been present at spiritualistic experiences where no trickery was possible. It was quite evident that there was no fluid from the spectators, no suggestion of persons surrounding the table who dictated the responses. Then, in giving its raps, the table expressed itself suddenly in English, though no one spoke that language. Then a few minutes later, addressing itself to me, who was at a distance from it, and consequently was not touching it, it told me this time in French, facts which I had forgotten, and I alone could know. I am then certainly obliged to suppose an element of the supernatural, using a table in guise of an interpreter, to accept if not the evocation of the dead, but at least the proved existence of ghosts. Then it is not more impossible, more surprising, that Christ should substitute himself for a piece of bread, than that a ghost should hide and brag in the foot of a table. These phenomena equally put our senses to rout. But if one of them be undeniable, and spiritualistic manifestation certainly is so, what motives can we invoke to deny the other, which is moreover attested by thousands of saints? After all, he went on with a smile, we have already demonstration by the absurd, but this may be called demonstration by the abject, for if the Eucharistic mystery is sublime, it is not the same with spiritualism, which is after all only the latrine of the supernatural. "If this were the only enigma," began the voice again, "but all the Catholic doctrines are on the same model. Examine religion from its birth, and see if it do not always issue by an absurd dogma. Here is a God infinitely perfect, infinitely good, a God who is not ignorant of past, present, or future. He knew then that Eve would sin, therefore of 2 things, one, either he is not good, in that he submitted her to that proof knowing that she had not power to stand it, or again he was not certain of her defeat, In that case he is not omniscient, he is not perfect. Durtal gave no answer to this dilemma, which is in fact difficult to resolve. Yet, he thought, we may at once exclude one of these two propositions, the latter, for it is childish to concern ourselves about the future when we have to do with God. We judge him by our miserable understanding, and there is for him neither present nor past, nor future. He sees them all at the same moment in light uncreate. For him distance has no figure, and space is naught. It is consequently impossible to doubt that the serpent will conquer. This amputated dilemma is then out of order. Be it so, but the other alternative remains. What do you make of his goodness? His goodness! And Durtal had need to repeat again the arguments drawn from free will and the promised coming of the Saviour, and he was obliged to admit that these answers were weak. And the voice became more pressing. Then you admit original sin. I am obliged to admit it because it exists. What are heredity and atavism, save under another name the terrible sin of the beginning? And does it appear to you just that innocent generations should make amends now and always for the sin of the first man? And as Durtal did not reply, the voice insinuated gently, this law is so iniquitous that it seems as if the Creator were ashamed of it, and that in order to punish himself for his ferocity, and not to make himself forever execrated by his creature, he wished to suffer on the cross, and expiate his crime in the person of his own Son. But, cried Durtal, exasperated, God could not commit a crime and punish himself. Were that so, Jesus would be the Redeemer of his Father, and not ours. It is madness. Little by little he recovered his balance. He recited slowly the Apostles' Creed, while the objections which demolished it pressed one after the other within him. There is one fact certain, he said to himself, for in all this tumult he was perfectly lucid, that for the moment we are two persons in one. I can follow my reasonings, and I hear on the other side the sophisms my double breathes in me. This duality has never appeared so clear to me. And the attack grew feebler on this reflection. It might have been believed that the enemy now discovered was beating a retreat. But nothing of the kind. After a short truce, the assault began again on another point. Are you very sure that you have not suggested and shown the blow to yourself? By having wished, you have ended by begetting belief, and by implanting in yourself a fixed idea, disguised under the name of grace, round which everything now clings. You complain that you did not experience sensible joys after your communion. This simply proves that you were not careful enough, or that, tired by the excess of the evening before, your imagination showed itself unready to play the infatuating fairy story you expected from yourself after the Mass. Moreover, you ought to know that in these questions all depends on the more or less feverish activity of the brain and the senses. See what takes place in the case of women, who deceive themselves more easily than men. For that again declares the difference of conformations, the variety between the sexes. Christ gives himself carnally under the appearances of bread. That is mystical marriage, the divine union consummated by the way of the lips. He is indeed the spouse of women, while we men, without willing it, by the very lodestone of our nature, are more attracted by the Virgin. But she does not give herself, like her Son, to us. She does not reside in the sacrament. Possession is, in her case, impossible. She is our mother, but she is not our spouse, as he is the spouse of virgins. We conceive, therefore, that women are more violently duped, that they adore better, and imagine more easily the more they are petted. Moreover, M. Bruno said to you yesterday, woman is more passive, less rebellious to the action of heaven. Well, what has that to do with me? What does that prove? That the more we love, the better we are loved. But if that axiom is false, from the earthly point of view, it is certainly exact from the divine point of view, which would be monstrous, and would come to this, that the Lord would not treat the soul of a poor Clare better than mine. There was again a time of rest, and the attack turned and rushed on a new place. Then you believe in an eternal hell? You suppose a God more cruel than yourself, a God who has created people, without their having been consulted, without their having asked to be born, and after having suffered during their existence, they will be again punished without mercy after their death. But consider, if you were to see your worst enemy in torture, you would be taken by pity, and would ask pardon for him. You would pardon, and the Almighty be implacable. You will admit this is to have a singular idea of him. Durtal was silent. Hell going on infinitely became in fact wearisome. The reply that it is legitimate, that punishment should be infinite, because rewards are so, was not decisive, since indeed it were the property of perfect goodness to abridge the chastisements and prolong the joys. But in fact, he said to himself, St. Catherine of Genoa has elucidated the question. She explains very well that God sends a ray of mercy, a current of pity into hell, that no damned soul suffers as much as it deserves to suffer, that if expiation ought not to cease, it may be modified, and weakened, and become at length less rigorous, less intense. She remarks also that at the moment of its separation from the body, the soul becomes obstinate or yields. If it remain hardened and shows no contrition for its faults, its guilt cannot be remitted, since, after death, free will subsists no more. The will which we possess at the moment of quitting the world remains invariable. If, on the contrary, it does not persist in those impenitent sentiments, a part of the repression will no doubt be removed, and consequently is not devoted to a continual Gehenna, as that which deliberately, while there is yet time, will not return to amendment, refuses in fact to lay aside its sins. Let us add that according to the saint, God does not even make the soul empty to be never polluted by sin, for it goes there of itself. It is led there by the very nature of its sins. It flings itself in as into its own good, is, if one may say so, naturally engulfed there. In fact, we may imagine to ourselves a very small hell and a very large purgatory. May imagine that hell is scantily peopled, is only reserved for cases of rare wickedness, that in reality the crowd of disincarnate souls presses into purgatory, and there endures punishments proportioned to the misdeeds it has willed here below. These ideas have nothing which cannot be sustained, and they have the advantage of being in accord with the ideas of mercy and justice. "Exactly," replied the voice in railing tones. "Man then will do well to constrain himself. He may steal, rob, kill his father, and violate his daughter. The price is the same. Provided he repent at the last minute, he is saved." But no, contrition takes away the eternity of punishment only, and not punishment itself. Everyone must be punished or rewarded according to his works. He who will be soiled by a parricide or an incest will bear a chastisement different in pain and length to him who has not committed them. Equality in expiatory suffering, in reparative pain, does not exist. Moreover, this idea of a purgative life after death is so natural, so certain, that all religions assume it. All consider the soul as a sort of air balloon, which cannot mount and attain its last end in space except by throwing away its ballast. In the religions of the East, the soul is reincarnistic. In order to purify itself, it rubs itself against a new body, like a blade in sandstone troughs, to brighten it. For us Catholics it undergoes no terrestrial avatar, but it lightens and scours itself, clears itself in the purgatory, where God transforms it, draws it out, extracts it little by little from the dross of its sins, till it can raise itself and lose itself in him. To have done with this irritating question of a perpetual hell, why not conceive that divine justice hesitates in the majority of cases to pronounce inexorable decrees? Humanity is for the most part composed of unconscious rascals and fools, who do not take any count on the reach of their faults. These are saved by their complete want of comprehension. As for others who rot, knowing what they do, they are evidently more blameworthy. But society, which hates superior beings, takes on itself their punishment, humiliates and persecutes them, and it is therefore allowed us to hope that our Lord will pity these poor souls so miserably pelted during their stay upon earth by a horde of fools. Then there is every advantage in being imbecile, since one is spared both on earth and in heaven? Ah, certainly. And yet, what is the good of discussion, since we cannot frame for ourselves the least idea of the infinite justice of a God? Moreover, this is enough. These debates overwhelm me. He tried to distract his thoughts from these subjects, and would fain to break the obsession, betake himself to Paris. But 5 minutes had not passed before his double returned to the charge. He entered once more on that halting dilemma which had so recently assailed the goodness of the Creator in regard to the sins of man. "Purgatory is then exorbitant, for after all," said he, "God knew that man would yield to temptations. Then why allow them, and above all, why condemn them? Is that goodness? Is that justice?" "But it is a sophism," cried Durtal, growing angry. "God has left to every man his liberty. No one is tempted beyond his power. If in certain cases he allows the seduction to overpass our means of resistance, It is to recall us to humility, to bring us back to him by remorse, for other causes which we know not, which it is not his business to show us. Then probably those transgressions are appreciated in a different way to those which we have practised with our full accord. The liberty of man, it is a pretty thing. Yes, let us speak of it, and atavism, and our surroundings and diseases of the brain and of the marrow. Is a man driven by the impulses of sickness, overwhelmed by troubles of the generative organs, responsible for his acts? But what can be said if under these conditions these acts are imputed to him on high? It is after all idiotic always to compare divine justice to man's tribunals. For it is exactly the contrary. Human judgments are often so infamous that they attest the existence of another equity. Rather than the proofs of a theodicy, the magistrature proves God. For without him, how can be satisfied that instinct of justice so innate in each of us, that even the humblest beast possesses it? Yet, replied the voice, all this does not hinder the change of character according as the stomach does its work ill or well. Slander, anger, envy, or accumulated bile, or faulty digestion. Good temper, joy, come from a free circulation of blood, the expansion of the body at will. Mystics are an emo-nervous people. Your ecstatics are hysterical patients badly fed. Madhouses are full of them. They depend on science when visions begin. All at once Durtal recovered himself. The material arguments were but little disquieting, for none could remain standing. All confounded the function and the organ, the lodger and the lodging, the clock and the hour. Their assertions rested on no base. To liken the happy lucidity and unequalled genius of a Saint Teresa to the extravagances of nymphomaniacs and other madwomen were so obtuse, so clumsy, that it could only raise a smile. The mystery would remain complete. No doctor has been able to discover or could discover the psyche in those round or fusiform cells, in the white matter or grey substance of the brain. They would recognize more or less justly the organs which the soul uses to pull the strings of the puppet, which it is condemned to move, but itself remains invisible. It has gone, when after death they force open the rooms of its habitation. No, these newsmongers have no effect on me, Durtal assured himself. But does this one do any better? Do you believe in the utility of life, in the necessity of this endless chain, this towage of sufferings, to be prolonged for the most part after death? True goodness would have consisted in inventing nothing, creating nothing, in leaving all as it was, in nothingness, in peace. The attack turned round on itself, and after apparent variations returned always to the same starting point. Durtal lowered his head, for this argument dismasted him. All the replies which could be imagined were remarkably weak, and the least feeble, that which consists in denying to ourselves the right to judge because we only see the details of the divine plan, because we can possess no general view of it, cannot avail against that terrible phrase of Schopenhauer: "If God made the world, I would not be that God, for the misery of the world would break my heart." There is no haggling in the matter, he said to himself. I can quite understand that sorrow is the true disinfectant of souls, yet I am obliged to ask myself why the Creator has not invented a less atrocious way of purifying us. Ah, when I think of the sufferings shut up in madhouses and hospital wards, I am revolted and inclined to doubt everything. If, again, grief were an antiseptic for future misdeeds, or a detersive for past faults, one might again understand, but now it falls indifferently on the bad and on the good. It is blind. The best proof is the Virgin who was without spot, and who had not like her Son to expiate for us. She consequently ought not to be punished, yet she too underwent at the foot of Calvary the punishment exacted by this horrible law. Good. But then, replied Durtal after a silence of reflection, if the innocent Virgin has given us an example, by what right do we who are culpable dare to complain? No, we must therefore resolve to dwell in darkness, to live surrounded by enigmas. Money, love, nothing is clear. Chance, if it exists, is as mysterious as Providence, and indeed still more so. It is inexplicable. God is at least an origin of the unknown, a key. An origin which is itself another secret, a key which opens nothing. Ah, it is irritating, he said to himself, to be thus harassed in every sense. Enough of it. Besides, these are questions which a theologian is alone able to discuss. I am unarmed, the game is not equal. I will not answer any more." And he could not but hear a vague laughter which arose in him. He quitted the garden and directed his steps towards the chapel, but the fear of being seized again by the madness of blasphemy turned him away from it. Knowing not whither to go, he regained his cell, saying to himself that he ought not to wrangle thus. Yes, but how could he help hearing the cavils which rose he knew not whence? He almost shouted aloud, "Be silent, let the other speak!" When he was in his chamber he desired to pray, and fell on his knees at his bedside. This was abominable, for memories of Florence recurred to him. He rose, but the old aberrations returned. He thought of that creature, her strange tastes, her mania for biting his ears, for drinking toilet scents in little glasses, for nibbling bread and butter with caviare and dates. She was so wild and so strange, a fool no doubt, but obscure. "And if she were in this room before you, what would you do?" He stammered to himself. "I would try not to yield." "You lie. Admit then that you would send your conversion, the monastery, all to the devil." He grew pale at the thought. The possibility of his cowardice was a punishment. To have communicated, when one was no more certain of the future, no more certain of oneself, was almost a sacrilege, he thought. And he became angry. Up till now he had kept right, but the vision of Florence subdued him. He threw himself, in desperation, on a chair, no longer knowing what would become of him, gathering what of courage remained to him to descend to the church, where the office was beginning. He dragged himself there, and held himself down, assailed by filthy temptations, disgusted with himself, feeling his will yielding, wounded in every part. And when he was in the court he remained overwhelmed, asking himself where he could take shelter. Every place had become hostile to him. In his cell were carnal memories, outside were temptations against faith. "Or rather," he cried, "I carry these with me always. My God! My God! I was yesterday so tranquil." He strolled by chance into an alley, when a new phenomenon arose. He had had, up to this hour, in the sky within him, a rain of scruples, a tempest of doubts, a thunderstroke of lust. Now was silence and death. Complete darkness was within him. He sought his soul by groping for it, and found it inert, without consciousness, almost icy. He had a body living and healthy. All his intelligence, all his reason, and his other powers, his other faculties, were benumbed little by little, and stopped. In his being there was manifested an effect at once analogous and contrary to that which curara produces on the organism, when it circulates in the network of the blood. The members are paralyzed, no pain is experienced, but cold rises, the soul ends by being sequestered alive in a corpse. In this case it was the living body that detained a dead soul. Harassed by fear, he disengaged himself with a supreme effort. He would make a visit to himself, see where he was, and like a sailor who descends into the hold in a ship that has sprung a leak, he had to step backwards, for the gangway was cut, the steps opened upon an abyss. In spite of the terror which rushed upon him, he hung fascinated over the hole, and by fixing the black point he distinguished appearances. In a light as of eclipse in rarefied air, he perceived at the basis of himself the panorama of his soul, a desert twilight on the horizons that approached the night, and under this doubtful light there seemed something like bare fields, a marsh heaped with rubbish and cinders. The place of the sins torn up by the confessor remained visible, but besides the dry charnel of dead vices which grew still, nothing budded. He saw himself exhausted. He knew that he had no further force to extirpate the last roots, and he fancied that he had again to sow the seed of virtues, to till this arid soil, manure this dead ground. He felt himself incapable of all work, and had at the same time the conviction that God rejected him, that God would aid him no more. This certainty tore him to pieces. It could not be expressed, for nothing could translate the anxiety, the anguish of a state through which he must have passed who could understand it. The terror of a child who has never left its mother's petticoats, and who is deserted without warning in the open country in a fog, could only give a vestige of an idea of it. And again by reason of his age the child, after having felt desolate, would end by growing calmer, by distracting himself from his grief, no longer seeing the danger which surrounds him, while in this state is danger, clinging and absolute, the immovable thought of abandonment, obstinate fear, which nothing diminishes, nothing appeases. One dare not advance nor retreat, rather cast oneself on the ground with bowed head, and wait the end of what we know not, and be assured that the menaces we ignore, and those at which we guess, are removed. Durtal was at this point. He could not return on his steps, for the way he had quitted horrified him. He would rather have died than return to Paris, there to begin again his carnal experiences, to live again his libertinage and lassitude. But if he could not again retrace his road, neither could he advance, for the road ended in a blind alley. If the earth repulsed him, heaven at the same time was closed for him. He was lying half on his side in the darkness, in the shade, he knew not where. And this state was aggravated by an absolute failure to understand the causes which brought him there, was exaggerated by the memory of graces before received. Durtal remembered the sweetness of the beginning, the caress of the divine touches, the steady progress without obstacles, the encounter with a solitary priest, his being sent to La Trappe, the very ease with which he bent to the monastic life, the absolution which had such truly sensible effects, the rapid and clear answer that he might communicate without fear. And suddenly, without his will, he had in fact failed. He who had till then held him by the hand, refused to guide him, cast him off into the darkness without a word. "All is over," he thought. "I am condemned to float here below like a waif which no one wants. No shore is henceforward accessible, for if the world refuses me, I disgust God. Ah, Lord, remember the Garden of Gethsemane, the tragic defection of the Father whom thou didst implore in unspeakable pangs." In the silence which received his cry he gave way, and yet he desired to react against this desolation, endeavoured to escape from his despair. He prayed, and had again that very precise sensation that his petitions did not carry, were not even heard. He called her who superintends allegiance, the mediatrix of pardon, to his aid, and he was persuaded that the Virgin heard him no longer. He was silent and discouraged, while the shade grew still more dense, and complete darkness covered him. He did not then suffer any longer in the true sense of the word, but it was worse, for this was annihilation in the void, the giddiness of a man who is bent over a gulf. And the scraps of reasoning which he could gather and knit together in this breaking up, ended by branching out into scruples. He sought for any sins which since his communion might justify such a trial, and he could not find them. He even tried to magnify his small faults, enlarge his want of patience. He wished to convince himself that he had taken a certain pleasure in finding the image of Florence in his cell, and he tortured himself so violently that he reanimated the soul, which had half fainted, by these moxas, and placed it again, without wishing it, in that acute state of scruples, in which it was when the crisis declared itself. And in these brawling reflections he did not lose the sad faculty of analysis. He said to himself while gauging himself at a glance, "I am like the litter in a circus, trodden down by all the sorrows which go and come to play their parts. Doubts about faith, which seem to stretch into every sense, turned in fact in the same circle. And now scruples, from which I thought myself freed, reappear and course through me." How should he explain this? Was he who inflicted this torture on him the spirit of malice, or God? That he had been bruised by the evil one was certain. The very nature of his attacks showed his handiwork. But how could this abandonment of God be explained? For in fact, the demon could not prevent the Saviour from assisting him, and he was quite obliged to conclude that if he were martyrized by the one, the other took no interest in him, let him be, and retired from him completely. This certainty deduced from precise observations, this reasoned assurance, finished him. He cried out from the anguish of it, looking at the pond by which he was walking, wishing he might fall in, thinking that death by drowning were preferable to such a life. Then he trembled before the water which attracted him, and carried away his sorrows to the charm of the woods. He tried to wear himself out by long walking, but he wearied himself without effect, and he ended by sinking down worn and broken at the refectory table. He looked at his plate, with no courage to eat, no desire to drink. He breathed hard, and exhausted as he was, could not keep in one place. He rose and wandered in the court till Compline, and there in the chapel, where at least he hoped to find some solace, was the crowning point of all. The mine went off. The soul, sapped since the morning, exploded. On his knees, desolate, he tried again to invoke help, and nothing came. He choked, immured in so deep a trench, under a vault so thick, that every appeal was stifled, and no sound vibrated. Without courage, he wept with his head in his hands, and while he complained to God that he had brought him thither to punish him in a Trappist monastery, ignoble visions assailed him. Fluids passed before his face, and peopled the space with priapisms. He did not see them with the eyes of his body, which were in no degree hallucinated, but perceived them outside him, and felt them within him. In a word, the touch was external and the vision internal. He tried to gaze on the statue of St. Joseph, before which he kept himself, and to see nothing of it, but his eyes seemed to revolve, to see only within, and were filled with indecencies. It was a medley of apparitions with undecided outlines, and confused colours, which gained precision only in those parts coveted by the secular infamy of man. And this changed again. The human forms vanished. There remained only, in invisible landscapes of flesh, marshes reddened by the fires of what sunset it was impossible to say, marshes shuddering under the divided shelter of the grasses. Then the sensual spot grew smaller still, but remained, and this time did not move. It was the growth of an unclean flood, the spreading of the daisy of darkness, the unfolding of the lotus of the caverns, hidden at the bottom of the valley. And there, burning gasps excited Durtal, enwrapped him, stifled him with furious gasps which drank his mouth. He looked in spite of himself, unable to withdraw himself from the outrages imposed by these violations, but the body was still and remained calm, while the soul revolted with a groan. The temptation was then of no effect, but if the tricks only succeeded in suggesting to him disgust and horror, they made him suffer beyond measure, while they delayed. All the days of his shameful existence came to the surface, all these enticements to greedy desires crucified him. Joined to the sum of sorrows accumulated since the dawn, the overcharge of these sorrows overwhelmed him, and a cold sweat bathed him from head to foot. He was in agony, and suddenly, as though he had come to overlook his ministers, and to see if his orders were carried out, the executioner himself entered on the scene. Durtal did not see him, but felt him, and it was indescribable. Since he had the impression of a real demoniac presence, his whole soul trembled and desired to fly, like a terrified bird that clings to the window-panes. And it fell back exhausted. Then, unlikely as it may appear, the parts of his life were inverted, the body was upright, and held its own, commanding the terrified soul, repressed this panic in a furious tension. Durtal perceived very plainly and clearly for the first time the distinction, the separation of the soul from the body, and for the first time also he was conscious of the phenomenon of a body, which had so tortured its companion by its needs and wants, to forget all its hatred in the common danger, and hinder her who resisted it, the habit of sinking. He saw that in a flash, and suddenly all vanished. It seemed that the demon had taken himself off, the wall of darkness which encompassed Durtal opened, and light issued from all parts. With an immense impulse the Salve Regina, springing up from the choir, swept aside the phantoms, and put the goblins to flight. The elevated cordial of this chant restored him. He took courage, and began again to hope that this frightful desertion might cease. He prayed, and his petitions found vent. He understood that they were at last heard. The office was at an end. He gained the guest-house, and when he appeared so worn out and pale before Father Etienne and the oblate, they cried, "What is the matter with you?" He sank on a chair, and endeavoured to describe to them the terrible Calvary he had climbed. "This has lasted," he said, "for more than 9 hours. I wonder that I have not gone mad." And he added, "Yet I never could have believed that the soul could suffer so much." The face of the father was illuminated. He pressed Durtal's hands and said, "Rejoice, my brother, you have been treated here like a monk." "How is that?" said Durtal, surprised. "Yes, this agony, for there is no other word to define the horror of the state, is one of the most serious trials which God inflicts on us. It is one of the operations of the purgative life. Be happy, for it is a great grace which Jesus does to you." "And this proves that your conversion is good," affirmed the oblate. "God! But it was not he, at any rate, who insinuated doubts about the faith, who caused to be born in me that madness of scruples, who raised in me that spirit of blasphemy, who caressed my face with disgusting apparitions. No, but he allows it. It is frightful, I know it, said the guest master. God conceals himself, and however you may call on him, he does not answer you. You think yourself deserted, yet he is very near you. And while he effaces himself, Satan advances. He twists you about, places a microscope over your faults, his malice gnaws your brain like a dull file, and when to all this are joined, to try you to the utmost, impure visions. The Trappist stopped, then speaking to himself, he said slowly, It would be nothing to be in presence of a real temptation, of a true woman in flesh and bone, but these appearances on which imagination works are horrible. And I used to think there was peace in the cloister. No, we are here on this earth to strive, and it is just in the cloister that the lowest works. There souls escape him, and he will at all price conquer them. No place on earth is more haunted by him than a cell, no one is more harassed than a monk. A story which is told in the lives of the fathers in the desert is typical from this point of view. One demon only was charged to watch a town, and he went to sleep while 200 or 300 demons who had orders to guard a monastery had no rest, but behaved themselves, here is the place for the phrase, like very devils. And indeed the mission to increase the sin of the towns is a sinecure, for Satan holds them, though they are not aware of it. All then he has to do is to torment them so as to take from them trust in God, since all obey him without his taking the least trouble about it. And so he keeps his legions to besiege convents where resistance is determined. And indeed you see the way in which he conducts the attack. Ah, exclaimed Durtal, it is not he who makes you suffer the most, for what is worse than scruples, worse than temptations against purity or against the faith, is the supposed abandonment of heaven. No, nothing can describe that. That is what mystical theology calls the night obscure, answered M. Bruno. And Durtal exclaimed, Ah, now I am with you. I remember. That is why St. John of the Cross declares that it is impossible to describe the sorrows of that night, and why he exaggerates nothing when he says that one is then plunged alive into hell. And I doubted the veracity of his books, I accused him of excess. Rather, he minimized. Only one must have felt this oneself to believe it. And you have seen nothing, the oblate replied quietly. You have passed through the first portion of that night, through the night of the senses. It is terrible enough, as I know by experience, but it is nothing in comparison with the night of the spirit which sometimes succeeds it. That is the exact image of the sufferings which our Lord endured in the Garden of Olives, when, sweating blood, he cried at the end of his force, Lord, let this chalice pass from me. This is so terrible. And M. Bruno was silent and grew pale. Whoever has undergone that martyrdom, he said after a pause, knows beforehand what awaits the damned in another life. But, said the monk, the hour of bedtime has struck. There exists but one remedy for all these evils, the Holy Eucharist. Tomorrow, Sunday, the community approaches the sacrament. You must join us. But I cannot communicate in the state in which I am. Well then, be up tonight at 3 o'clock. I will come for you to your cell, and will take you to Father Maximin, who confesses us at that time. And without waiting for his answer, the guest-master pressed his hand and went. He is right, said the oblate. It is the true remedy. And when he had regained his room, Durtal thought, I now understand why the Abbé Gévresin made such a point of lending me St. John of the Cross. He knew that I should enter into the night obscure. He did not dare warn me clearly, for fear of alarming me, and yet he would put me on my guard against despair, and aid me by the remembrance here of that reading. Only how could he think that in such a shipwreck I should remember anything? All this makes me think that I have omitted to write to him, and that tomorrow I must keep my promise by sending him a letter. And he thought again of St. John of the Cross, that extraordinary Carmelite, who described so placidly that terrible phase of the mystic Genesis. He took count of the lucidity, the power of spirit of this saint, explaining the most obscure vicissitude of the soul and the least known, catching and following the operations of God, who dealt with that soul, pressed it in his hands, squeezed it like a sponge, then let it suck up again, fill itself with sorrows, then wrung it again, making it drip tears of blood to cleanse it. End of Part 2, Chapter 5. Part 2, Chapter 6 of En route by Joris-Karl HUYSMANS, translated by Charles Kegan Paul. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. "No," said Durtal in a whisper, "I will not take the place of these good people. But I assure you it is quite the same to them." And while Durtal was still refusing to go before the lay brothers who were waiting their turn for confession, Father Etienne insisted, "I will stay with you, and as soon as the cell is free you will enter." Durtal was then on the landing of a staircase on every step of which was posted a brother kneeling or standing, his head wrapped in his hood, his face turned to the wall. All were sifting and closely examining their souls. "Of what sins can they really accuse themselves?" thought Durtal. "Who knows?" he continued, perceiving Brother Anacletus, his head sunk on his breast, and his hands joined. "Who knows if he does not reproach himself for the discreet affection he has for me? For in monasteries all friendship is forbidden." And he called to memory in the Way of Perfection of Saint Teresa, a page at once glowing and icy, in which she cries out on the nothingness of human ties, declares that friendship is a weakness, and asserts clearly that every nun who desires to see her relations is imperfect. "Come," said Father Etienne, who interrupted these reflections, and pushed him towards the door of the cell out of which a monk came. Father Maximin was there, seated close to Prie-Dieu. Durtal knelt, and told him briefly his scruples and strifes of the evening before. "What has happened to you is not surprising after a conversion. Indeed, it is a good sign, for those persons alone for whom God has views are submitted to these proofs," said the monk slowly, when Durtal had ended his story. And he continued, "Now that you have no more grave sins, the demon endeavours to drown you by spitting at you. In fact, in these episodes of malice at bay, there is for you temptation and no sin. You have, if I may sum up what you have said, undergone temptation of the flesh and of faith, and you have been tortured by scruples. Let us leave on one side the sensual visions. Such as they have been were produced independently of your will, painful no doubt, but ineffectual. Doubts about faith are more dangerous. Steep yourself in this truth that besides prayer there exists but one efficacious remedy against this evil, to despise it. Satan is pride. Despise him, and at once his audacity gives way. He speaks. Shrug your shoulders and he is silent. You must not discuss with him. However good a reasoner you may be, you will be worsted, for he is a most tricky dialectician." "Yes, but what can I do? I do not wish to listen to him, but I hear him all the same. I was obliged to answer him if only to refute him. And it was just on that he counted to subdue you. Keep this carefully in your mind. In order to let you give him an easy throw, he will present you at need grotesque arguments, and so soon as he sees you confident, simply satisfied with the excellence of your replies, he will involve you in sophisms so specious that you will fight in vain to solve them. No, I repeat to you, had you the best reasons to oppose to him, do not riposte, refuse the strife." The prior was silent. Then he began again quietly. "There are two ways of getting rid of a thing which troubles you: to throw it far away, or let it fall. To throw it to a distance demands an effort of which one may not be capable. To let it fall imposes no fatigue, is simple, without danger, within the reach of all. To throw to a distance implies again a certain interest, a certain animation, perhaps even a certain fear. To let it fall is indifference, complete contempt. Believe me, use this means and Satan will fly. This weapon of contempt will also be all-powerful to conquer the assault of scruples, if in combats of this nature the person assailed sees clear. Unfortunately, the peculiarity of scruples is to alarm people, to make them lose at once the clearing breeze, and then it is indispensable to have recourse to a priest to defend oneself. Indeed, pursued the monk, who had interrupted himself a moment to think, the closer one looks, the less one sees. One becomes short-sighted the moment one observes. It is necessary to place oneself at a certain point of view to distinguish objects, for when they are very close they become as confused as if they were far. Therefore, in such a case we must have recourse to the confessor, who is neither too distant nor too near, who holds himself precisely at the spot where objects detach themselves in their relief. Only it is with scruples as with certain maladies which, when they are not taken in time, become almost incurable. Do not allow them, then, to become implanted in you. Scruple cannot resist being told as soon as it begins. The moment you formulate it before the priest it dissolves. It is a kind of mirage which a word effaces. You will object to me, continued the monk after a silence, that it is very mortifying to avow delusions which generally are absurd. But it is for this very reason that the demon suggests to you less clever arguments than foolish. He takes hold of you thus by vanity, by false shame. The monk was silent again. Then he continued, Scruples not treated, scruples not cured, lead to discouragement, which is the worst of temptations. For in other cases Satan attacks one virtue only in particular, and he shows himself, while in this case he attacks all at once, and he hides himself. And this is so true that if you are seduced by lust, by the love of money, or by pride, you can, in examining yourself, give yourself account of the nature of the temptation which exhausts you. In discouragement, on the contrary, your understanding is obscured to such a degree that you do not even suspect that the state in which you succumb is only a diabolic manoeuvre which you must combat, and you let go all, you give up the only arm which can save you, prayer, from which the demon turns you aside as a vain thing. Never hesitate, then, to cut the evil at its root, to take care of a scruple as soon as it is born. Now tell me, you have nothing else to confess? No, except the indesire for the Eucharist, the languor in which I now faint. There is some fatigue in your case, for no one can endure such a shock with impunity. Do not be uneasy about that. Have confidence. Do not attempt to present yourself before God all neat and trim. Go to Him simply, naturally, in undress even, just as you are. Do not forget that if you are a servant you are also a son. Have good courage. Our Lord will dispel all these nightmares. And when he had received absolution, Durtal went down to the church to await the hour of Mass. And when the moment for communion came, he followed M. Bruno behind the lay brothers. All were kneeling on the pavement, and one after the other rose to exchange the kiss of peace and reach the altar. Though he repeated to himself the counsels of Father Maximin, though he exhorted himself to dismiss all his unrest, Durtal could not help thinking as he saw these monks approach the table, "The Lord will find a change when I advance in my turn. Having descended into the sanctuaries, he will be reduced to visit hovel." And sincerely, humbly, he was sorry for him. And as the first time that he approached this peace-giving mystery, he experienced a sensation of stifling, as if his heart were too large when he returned to his place. As soon as the Mass was over, he quitted the chapel and escaped into the park. Then gently, without sensible effects, the sacrament worked. Christ opened, little by little, his closed house and gave it air. Light entered into Durtal in a flood. From the windows of his senses, which had looked till then into he knew not what cesspool, into what enclosure, dank and steeped in shadow, he now looked suddenly through a burst of light on a vista which lost itself in heaven. His vision of nature was modified, the surroundings were transformed, the fog of sadness which visited them vanished. The sudden clearness of his soul was repeated in its surroundings. He had the sensation of expansion, the almost childlike joy of a sick man who takes his first outing, of the convalescent who, having long crawled in a chamber, sets foot without. All grew young again. These alleys, this wood, through which he had wandered so much, which he began to know in all their windings, and in every corner, began to appear to him in a new aspect. A restrained joy, a repressed gladness emanated from this sight, which appeared to him, instead of extending as formerly, to draw near and gather round the crucifix, to turn, as it were, with attention towards the liquid cross. The trees rustled trembling in a whisper of prayers, inclining towards the Christ, who no longer twisted his painful arms in the mirror of the pool, but he constrained these waters, and displayed them before him, blessing them. They were themselves different. The dark fluid was covered with monastic visions, in white robes, which the reflections of clouds left there in passing, and the swan scattered them, in a splash of sunlight, making as he swam great oily circles round him. One might have said that these waves were gilt by the oil of the catechumens and the sacred chrism, which the Church exorcises on the Saturday of Holy Week, and above them heaven half opened its tabernacle of clouds, out of which came a clear sun like a monstrance of molten gold in a blessed sacrament of flames. It was a benediction of nature, a genuflection of trees and flowers, singing in the wind, incensing with their perfume the sacred bread which shone on high in the flaming custody of the planet. Durtal looked on in transport. He desired to cry aloud his enthusiasm and his faith to the landscape. He felt a joy in living. The horror of existence counted for nothing when there were such moments, as no earthly happiness can give. God alone had the power of thus filling a soul, of making it overflow, and rush in floods of joy. And He alone could also fill the basin of sorrows, as no event in this world could do. Durtal had just tried it. His spiritual sufferings and joys attained under the divine imprint an acuteness, which people most humanly happy or unhappy cannot even suspect. This idea brought him back to the terrible distresses of the evening before. He endeavoured to sum up what he had been able to observe of himself in this Trappist monastery. First, the clear distinction between body and soul. Then the action of the demon, insinuating and obstinate, almost visible, while the heavenly action remained, on the contrary, dull and veiled, appeared only at certain moments, and seemed at others to vanish forever. And all this, when felt and understood, had an appearance simple in itself, but scarcely explaining itself. The body appearing to throw itself forward to the rescue of the soul, and no doubt borrowing from it its will, to help it when it fainted, was unintelligible. How a body could itself react obscurely, and yet show, all at once, so strong a decision that it pressed its companion into a vice, and prevented its flight. It is as mysterious as the rest, thought Durtal, and as in a dream he continued, the secret action of Jesus in his sacrament is not less strange, if I may judge by what has happened to me. A first communion exasperates the action of the devil, while a second represses it. Ah, and how I put myself in line with all my calculations! In taking shelter here, I thought myself pretty sure of my soul, and that my body would trouble me, whereas just the contrary has been the case. My stomach has grown vigorous and shown itself fit to support an effort of which I should never have thought it capable, and my soul has been below everything, vacillating and dry, so fragile, so feeble. But we will let all that alone. He walked about, lifted from earth by a confused joy. He grew vaporized in a sort of intoxication, in a vague etherization, in which arose, without his even thinking of formulating words, acts of thanksgiving. It was an effort of thanks of his soul, of his body, of his whole being, to that God whom he felt living in him, and diffused in that kneeling landscape which also seemed to expand in mute hymns of gratitude. The hour which struck by the clock in the portico reminded him it was breakfast time. He went to the guest-house, cut himself a slice of bread and butter with some cheese, drank half a glass of wine, and was about to go out again when he reflected that the horary of the officers was changed. They must be different from those of the week, he thought, and he went up into his cell to consult his placards. He found only one, that of the rule of the monks themselves, which contained the regulations for the Sunday practices for the cloister, and he read, Exercises of the community for all ordinary Sundays. Morning. 1. Rise, little office. Prayer till 1:30. 2. Grand Canonical Office chanted. 5:30. Prime, Morning Mass, 6 o'clock. 6:45. Chapter Instructions, Great Silence. 9:15. Asperges, Tierce, Procession. 10. High Mass. 11:10. Sext and Special Examination. 11:30. Angelus, Dinner. 12:15. Siesta, Great Silence. Evening. 2. End of Repose, None. 4. Vespers and Benediction. 5:45. Quarter of an hour for prayer. 6. Supper. 7. Reading before Compline. 7:15. Compline. 7:30. Salve, Angelus. 7:45. Examination of conscience and retreat. 8. Bedtime, Great Silence. Note: after the Cross of September, no siesta. None is at 2 o'clock, Vespers at 3, supper at 5, Compline at 6, and bedtime at 7. Durtal copied this rule for his use on a scrap of paper. In fact, he said to himself, I have to be in chapel at 9:15 for asperges, high mass, and the office of sext, afterwards at 2 for none, then at 4 for vespers and benediction, and lastly at 7:30 for compline. Here is a day which will be occupied, without counting that I got up at 2:30 this morning, he concluded, and when he reached the chapel about 9 o'clock, he found the greater part of the lay brothers on their knees, the others saying their rosary, and when the clock struck all returned to their place. Assisted by 2 fathers in cowls, the prior, vested in a white alb, entered, and while the antiphon Asperges me, Domine, Hysopo et Mundabor was sung, all the monks in succession defiled before Father Maximin, standing on the steps, turning his back to the altar, and he sprinkled them with holy water while they regained their stalls, each making the sign of the cross. Then the prior descended from the altar and came to the entrance to the vestibule, where he dispersed the water crosswise, traced by the sprinkler over the oblate and over Durtal. At last he vested and went to celebrate the sacrifice. Then Durtal was able to think over his Sundays at the Benedictine nuns. The Kyrie eleison was the same, but slower and more sonorous, more grave on the prolonged termination of the last word. At Paris the voices of the nuns drew it out and put a gloss on it at the same time, turned into satin its final sound, rendered it less dull, less spaced, less ample. The Gloria in excelsis differed. That of La Trappe was more primitive, more mounting, more sombre, interesting by its very barbarism, but less touching, for in its forms of adoration, in the Adoramus Te, for example, the Te did not detach itself, did not drop like a tear of amorous essence, like an avowal retained by humility on the tip of the lips. But it was when the Credo arose that Durtal could uplift himself at ease. He had never yet heard it so authoritative, and so imposing. It advanced, chanted in unison, developing its slow procession of dogmas, in sounds well furnished and rigid, of a violet almost obscure, a red almost black, growing lighter towards the end, till it expired in a long and plaintive Amen. In following the Cistercian office, Durtal could recognize the morsels of plain chant still preserved in parish masses. All the part of the canon, the sursum corda, the vere dignum, the antiphons, the pater, remained intact. Only the Sanctus and the Agnus Dei were changed. Massive, built up, as it were, in the Roman style, they draped themselves in the colour, glowing and dull, which clothes, in fact, the offices of La Trappe. "Well," said the oblate, when, after the ceremony, they sat at the table of the refectory. "Well, what do you think of our high mass?" "It is superb," answered Durtal, and he said dreamily, "Would that one would have the whole complete. To bring here, instead of this uninteresting chapel, the apse of Saint Severin, hang on the walls the pictures of Fra Angelico, Memling, Grunewald, Gérard David, Roger van de Veten, Boots. Add to these admirable sculptures such as those of the great door of Chartres, altar screens of sculptured wood, such as those of the Cathedral of Amiens. What a dream!" "Yet," he went on after a silence, "this dream has been a reality, it is evident. This ideal church existed for ages, everywhere in the Middle Ages. The chant, the goldsmith's work, the panels, the sculptures, the tissues were all attractive. The liturgies possessed, to give them value, fabulous caskets, but all that is far off." "But you certainly cannot say," replied M. Bruno with a smile, "that the church ornaments are ugly here." "No, they are exquisite. First, the chasubles have not the shapes of a miner's apron, and they do not hoist themselves up on the shoulders of the priest, that excrescence, that puffing like the ear of a little donkey lying back, which the vestment makers use at Paris. Nor is it any more that cross in stripe or woven, filling all the stuff, falling like a sackcoat over the back of the celebrant. The Trappist chasubles have kept the old form, as the old image-makers and the old painters preserved them in their religious scenes. And that cross with 4 leaves, like those which the Gothic style chiselled on the walls of its churches, is related to the very expanded lotus, a flower so full blown that its falling petals droop. Without counting, pursued Durtal, that the stuff which seems cut in a sort of flannel or thick soft felt must have been plunged in threefold dyes, for it takes a depth and a magnificent clearness of tone. The religious trimming makers could trim these watered and plain silks with silver and gold, yet never attain to give a colour at once so vehement and so familiar to the eye as that crimson with sulphur-yellow flowers which Father Maximin wore the other day." Yes, and the mourning chasuble with its lobed crosses and its discreet white fullings, in which the Father Abbot vested himself, the day on which he communicated us. Is it not also a caress for the eyes?" Durtal sighed. "Ah, if the statues in the chapel showed a like taste!" "By the way," said the oblate, "come and salute that Notre-Dame de l'Âtre of which I have spoken to you, found among the remains of the old cloister." They rose from table, passed along a corridor, and struck into a lateral gallery, at the end of which they stopped before a statue of life size in stone. It was heavy and massive, representing in a robe of long folds a peasant woman, crowned and round-cheeked, holding on her arm a child who blessed a ball. But in this portrait of a robust peasant woman, sprung from Burgundy or Flanders, there was a candour, a goodness almost tumultuous, which sprang from her smiling face, her innocent eyes, her good and large lips, indulgent, ready for all forgiveness. She was a rustic virgin made for the humble lay brothers. She was not a great lady who could hold them at a distance, but she was indeed the nursing mother of their souls, their true mother. How was it they had not understood her here? How, instead of presiding in the chapel, did she grow chill at the end of a corridor? Cried Durtal. The oblate turned the conversation. "I warn you," he said, "that benediction will not take place after Vespers as your placard indicates, but directly after Compline. This latter office will therefore be advanced a quarter of an hour at least." And the oblate went up into his cell, while Durtal went towards the large pond. There he lay down on a bed of dry reed, looking at the water which broke in wavelets at his feet. The coming and going of these limited waters, folding back on themselves, yet never overpassing the basin they had hollowed for themselves, led him on into long reveries. He said to himself that a river was the most exact symbol of the active life. One follows it from its source through all its courses across the territories it fertilizes. It has fulfilled its assigned task before it dies, immersing itself in the gaping sepulchre of the seas. But the pond, that tamed water, imprisoned in a hedge of reeds which it has itself caused to grow in fertilizing the soil of its bank, has concentrated itself, lived on itself, not seemed to achieve any known work, save to keep silence and reflect on the infinite of heaven. "Still water troubles me," continued Durtal. "It seems to me that, unable to extend itself, it grows deeper, and that while running waters borrow only the shadows of things they reflect, it swallows them without giving them back. Most certainly in this pond is a continued and profound absorption of forgotten clouds, of lost trees, even of sensations seized on the faces of monks who hung over it. This water is full and not empty, like those which are distracted in wandering about the country and in bathing the towns. It is a contemplative water, in perfect accord with the recollected life of the cloisters. The fact is," he concluded, "that a river would have here no meaning. It would only be passing, would remain indifferent and in a hurry, would be in all cases unfit to pacify the soul which the monastic water of the ponds appeases. Ah, in founding Notre-Dame de l'Âtre, Saint Bernard knew how to fit the Cistercian rule and the site. But we must leave these fancies," he said, rising, and remembering that it was Sunday, he transferred himself to Paris, and revisited in thought his halts on his day in the churches. In the morning Saint Severin enchanted him, but he ought not to thrust himself into that sanctuary for the other offices. Vespers there were botched and mean, and if it were a feast day the organ-master showed himself possessed by the love of ignoble music. Occasionally Durtal had taken refuge at Saint-Gervais, where at least they played at certain times motets of the old masters, but that church was, as well as Saint-Eustache, a paying concert, where faith had nothing to do. No recollection was possible in the midst of ladies who fainted behind, their faces in their hands, and grew agitated in creaking chairs. These were frivolous assemblies for pious music, a compromise between the theatre and God. Saint-Sulpice was better, where at least the public was silent. There, moreover, Vespers were celebrated with more solemnity and less haste. In general, the seminary reinforced the choir, and rendered by this imposing choir they rolled on majestically sustained by the grand organ. Chanted only in half and not in unison, reduced to a state of couplets, given, some by a baritone, others by the choir, they were twisted and frizzled by a curling iron, but as they were not less adulterated at the other churches, there was every advantage in listening to them at Saint-Sulpice, whose powerful choir, very well led, had not, as for example at Notre-Dame, those dusty voices which break at the least whisper. This only became really odious when, with a formidable explosion, the first strophe of the Magnificat struck the arches. The organ then swallowed up one stanza out of 2, and under the seditious pretext that the length of the office of incensing was too long to be filled up entirely by singing, M. Widor, seated at his desk, rolled forth stale fragments of music splashed about above, imitating the human voice and the flute, the bagpipe and the bassoon, or indeed, tired of affectations, he blew furiously on the keys, ending by imitating the roll of locomotives over iron bridges, letting all the stops go. And the choir master, not wishing to show himself inferior to the organist in his instinctive hatred of plain chant, was delighted, when the benediction began, to put aside Gregorian melodies and make his choristers gurgle rigadoons. It was no longer a sanctuary, but a howling place. The Ave Maria, the Ave Verum, all the mystical indecencies of the late Gounod, the rhapsodies of old Thomas, the capers of indigent music-casters, defiled in a chain wound by choir leaders from Lamoureux, chanted unfortunately by children, the chastity of whose voices no one feared to pollute in these middle-class passages of music, these byways of art. "Ah," thought Durtal, "if only this choir-master, who is evidently an excellent musician, for indeed, when he must, he knows how to get executed better than anywhere else in Paris the De Profundis with organ accompaniment and the Dies Irae, if only this man would, as at Saint-Gervais, give us some Palestrina and Vittoria, some Eichinger and Allegri, some Orlando Lasso and Depré. But no, he must detest these masters also, consider them as archaic rubbish, good to send into the dust-heaps." And Durtal continued, "What we hear now at Paris in the churches is wholly incredible. Under pretence of managing an income for the singers, they suppress half the stanzas of canticles and hymns, and substitute, to vary the pleasure, the tiresome divagations of an organ. There they howl the tantum ergo to the Austrian national air, or what is still worse, muffle it up with operatic choruses or refrains from canteens. The very text is divided into couplets which are ornamented like a drinking song with a little burthen. The other church sequences are treated in the same manner. And yet the papacy has formally forbidden, in many bulls, that the sanctuary should be soiled by those liberties. To cite one only, John 22, in his extravagant Doctor Sanctorum, expressly forbade profane voices and music in churches. He prohibited choirs at the same time to change plain chant into fioritori. The decrees of the Council of Trent are not less clear from this point of view, and more recently still a regulation of the Sacred Congregation of Rites has intervened to proscribe musical rioting in holy places. Then what are the parish priests doing, who, in fact, have musical police charge in their churches? Nothing, they laugh at it. Nor is this a mere phrase, but with those priests who, hoping for receipts, permit on fête days the shameless voices of actresses to dance gambols to the heavy sounds of the organ, the poor church has become far from clean. At Saint-Sulpice, Durtal went on, the priest tolerates the villainy of jolly songs which are served up to him, but at least he does not, like the one at Saint-Séverin, allow strolling women players to lighten up the office by the shouts of such voices as remain to them. Nor has he accepted the solo on the English horn which I heard at Saint Thomas one evening during the perpetual adoration. In short, if the grand benedictions at Saint-Sulpice are a shame, the complines remain, in spite of their theatrical attitude, really charming." And Durtal thought of those complines of which the paternity is often attributed to Saint Benedict. They were in fact the integral prayer of the evenings, the preventive adjuration, the safeguard against the attempts of the demon. They were in some measure the advanced sentinels of the outposts placed round the soul to protect it during the night. And the regulation of this entrenched camp of prayer was perfect. After the benediction the best trained voice, the most thread-like of the choir, the voice of the smallest of the children, sang forth the short lesson taken from the first epistle of St. Peter, warning the faithful that they must be sober and watch, not allow themselves to be surprised unexpectedly. A priest then recited the usual evening prayers, the choir organ gave the intonation, and the psalms fell, chanted one by one, the twilight psalms, in which before the approaches of night peopled with goblins and furrowed by ghosts, man calls God to aid, and prays him to guard his sleep from the violence of the ways of hell, the rape of the Lamias that pass. And the hymn of St. Ambrose, the Te Lucis ante terminum, made still more precise the scattered meaning of these psalms, gathering it up in its short stanzas. Unfortunately, the most important, That which foresees and declares the luxurious dangers of darkness was swallowed up by the full organ. This hymn was not rendered in plain chant at Saint-Sulpice as at La Trappe, but was sung to a pompous and elaborate air, an air full of glory, with a certain proud attractiveness, originating no doubt in the 18th century. Then there was a pause, and man, feeling himself more sheltered behind a rampart of prayers, recollected himself, more assured, and borrowed innocent voices to address new supplications to God. After the chapter read by the officiant, the children of the choir chanted the short response, In manus tuus, Domine, commendo spiritum meum, which rolled out, dividing in two parts, then doubled itself, and resolved at the last its two separate portions by a verse and part of an antiphon. And after that prayer there was still the canticle of Simeon, who, as soon as he had seen the Messiah, desired to die. This Nunc dimittis, which the Church has incorporated in Compline, to stimulate us at eventide to self-examination, for none can tell whether he shall wake on the morrow, was raised by the whole choir, which alternated with the responses of the organ. In fact, to end this office of a besieged town, to take its last dispositions and try to repose in shelter from a violent attack, the Church built up again a few prayers, and placed her parishes under the tutelage of the Virgin, to whom it chanted one of the 4 antiphons which follow, according to the Proper. At La Trappe, Compline was evidently less solemn, less interesting than at Saint-Sulpice, concluded Durtal, for the monastic breviary is, for a wonder, less complete for that office than the Roman breviary. As for Sunday Vespers, I am curious to hear them. And he heard them, but they hardly differed from the Vespers adopted by the Benedictine nuns of the Rue Monsieur. They were more massive, more grave, more Roman, if it may be said, for necessarily the voice of women drew them out into sharp points, made them like acute archers, as it were, in Gothic style, but the Gregorian tunes were the same. On the other hand, they resembled in nothing those at Saint-Sulpice, where the modern sources spoilt the very essences of the plain chants. Only the Magnificat of La Trappe, abrupt and with dry tone, was not so good as the majestic, the admirable royal Magnificat chanted at Paris. "These monks are astonishing with their superb voices," said Durtal to himself, and he smiled as they finished the antiphon of Our Lady, for he remembered that in the primitive church the chanter was called Fabarius Cantor, eater of beans, because he was obliged to eat that vegetable to strengthen his voice. Now, at La Trappe, dishes of beans were common. Perhaps that was the secret of the ever-young monastic voices. He thought over the liturgy and plain chant while smoking cigarettes in the walks after Vespers. He brought to mind the symbolism of those canonical hours which recalled every day to the Christian the shortness of life in summing up for him its image from infancy to death. Recited soon after dawn, Prime was the figure of childhood, Tierce of youth, Sext the full vigour of age, None the approaches of old age, while Vespers were an allegory of decrepitude. They belonged, moreover, to the nocturnes, and were sung about 6 o'clock in the evening, at that hour when, at the time of the equinoxes, the sun sets in the red cinder of the clouds. As for Compline, it resounds when night, the symbol of death, has come. This canonical office was a marvellous rosary of psalms. Every bead of each of these hours bore reference to the different phases of human existence, followed little by little the periods of the day, the decline of destiny, to end in the most perfect of offices, in Compline, that provisional absolution of a death, itself represented by sleep. And if from these texts so wisely selected, these sequences so solemnly sealed, Durtal passed to the sacerdotal robe of their sounds, to those pneumatic chants, that divine psalmody all uniform, all simple, which is plain chant, he had to admit that except in Benedictine cloisters, an organ accompaniment was everywhere added, that plain chant had been put forcibly in modern tonality, and it disappeared under vegetations which stifled it, became everywhere discoloured, amorphous and incomprehensible. Only one of its executioners, Niedermeyer, showed himself at least pitiful. He tried a system more ingenious and more honest. He reversed the terms of torture. Instead of wishing to make plain chant supple and to thrust it into the mould of modern harmony, he constrained that harmony to bend itself to the austere tonality of plain chant. He thus preserved its character, but how far more natural would it have been to leave it solitary, and not obliged it to tow an useless companion and awkward following. Here at least, at La Trappe, it lived and spread in all security, without treason on the part of the monks. There was always sameness of sound, it was always chanted without accompaniment in unison. He was able to satisfy himself about this truth once more after supper, that evening, when at the end of Compline the father sacristan lighted all the candles on the altar. At that moment, in the silence of the Trappists on their knees, their head in their hands, or their cheek resting on the sleeve of their great cowl, 3 lay brothers entered, 2 carrying torches, and another preceding them with a censer, and behind them a few paces came the prior with his hands joined. Durtal looked at the changed costume of the 3 brothers. They had no longer their robes of serge, made of bits and scraps, stained mud colour, but robes of violet brown, like plums on which was spread the white twilling of a new surplice. While Father Maximin, vested in a cope of milky white, woven with a cross in orange yellow, placed the host in the monstrance, the thurifer put down the censer, on the coals of which melted tears of real incense. Contrary to what takes place in Paris, where the censer, swung before the altar, sounds against its chains, and is like the clear tinkling of a horse which, as he lifts his head, shakes his curb and bit, the censer at La Trappe remained immovable before the altar, and smoked by itself behind the officiants. And everyone chanted the imploring and melancholy antiphon, Parce Domine, then the Tantum Ergo, that magnificent song, which could be almost acted, so clear in their changes are the sentiments which succeed each other in their rhymed sequence. In the first stanza it seems indeed to shake the head gently, to put forward the chin, so to speak, so as to affirm the insufficiency of the senses to explain the dogma of the real presence, the finished avatar of the bread. It is then admiring and reflective. Then that melody so attentive, so respectful, does not wait to affirm the weakness of the reason and the power of faith, but in the second stanza it goes forward, adores the glory of the 3 persons, exults with joy, only recovers itself at the end, where the music adds a new sense to the text of Saint Thomas, in avowing in a long and mournful Amen the unworthiness of those present to receive the benediction of the flesh placed upon that cross which the monstrance is about to trace in the air. And slowly, while unrolling its coil of smoke, the censer spread as it were a blue gauze before the altar, while the blessed sacrament was lifted like a golden moon, amid the stars of the tapers, sparkling in the growing darkness of that fog, the bells of the abbey sounded with musical and sweet strokes. And all the monks bowed low with their eyes closed, then recovered themselves and intoned the Laudate, to the old melody which is also sung at Notre-Dame des Victoires at the benediction in the evening. Then one by one, having genuflected before the altar, they went out, while Durtal and the oblate returned to the guest-house, where Father Etienne was waiting for them. He said to Durtal, "I would not go to bed without knowing how you have borne the day." And as Durtal thanked him, assuring him that this Sunday had been very peaceful, Father Etienne smiled and revealed in a word that under their reserved attitude all at La Trappe were more interested in their guest than he had himself believed. "The Reverend Father Abbot and the Father Prior will be glad when I give them this answer," said the monk, who wished Durtal good night, pressing his hand. End of Part 2, Chapter 6. Part 2, Chapter 7 of En route by Joris-Karl HUYSMANS. Translated by Charles Kegan Paul. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. At 7 o'clock, just as he was preparing to eat his bread, Durtal encountered Father Etienne. "Father," he said, "tomorrow is Tuesday. The time of my retreat has expired, and I am going. How should I order a carriage for Saint-Landry?" The monk smiled. "When the postman brings the letters, I can charge him with the commission, but let us see. Are you in a great hurry to leave us?" "No, but I would not trespass." "Listen. Since you are so well broken into the life at La Trappe, stay here 2 days more. The Father Procurator must go to settle a dispute at Saint-Landry. He will take you to the station in our carriage. So you will avoid some expense, and the journey hence to the railroad will seem to you less long, since there will be 2 of you." Durtal accepted, and as it rained, he went up to his room. "It is strange," he said as he sat down, "how impossible one finds it in a cloister to read a book. One wants nothing, one thinks of God by himself, and not by the volumes which speak about him." Mechanically he had taken up from a heap of books one in octavo, which he had found on his table the day he took possession of his cell. It bore the title Manresa,
or the spiritual exercises of Ignatius of Loyola. He had already run through the work at Paris, and the pages which he turned over afresh did not change the harsh, almost hostile opinion which he had retained of this book. The fact is that these exercises leave no initiative to the soul. They consider it as a soft paste good to run into a mould. They show it no horizon, no sky. Instead of trying to stretch it and make it greater, they make it smaller deliberately. They put it back into the cases of their wafer box, nourish it only on faded trifles, on dry nothings. This Japanese culture of deformed toes which remain dwarf, this Chinese deformation of children planted in pots, horrified Durtal, who closed the volume. He opened another, the Introduction to the Devout Life by Saint Francis de Sales. Certainly he found no need to read it again, in spite of its affectations and its good nature, at first charming, but which ends by making you sick, by making the soul sticky with sweets with liqueurs in them and lollipops. In a word, that work so much praised by Catholics was a julep scented with bergamot and ambergris. It was like a fine handkerchief shaken in a church in which a musty smell of incense remained. But the man himself, the Bishop Saint Francis de Sales, was suggestive. With his name was called up the whole mystical history of the 17th century. And Durtal recalled the memories he had kept of the religious life of that time. There were then in the Church two currents. That of the high mysticism, as it was called, originating from Saint Teresa and Saint John of the Cross, and this current was concentrated on Marie Guyon. Another was that of so-called temperate mysticism, of which the adepts were Saint Francis de Sales and his friend the celebrated Baroness de Chantal. It was naturally this second current which triumphed. Jesus, putting himself within the reach of drawing-rooms, descending to the level of women of the world, a moderate and proper Jesus, only dealing with the soul of his creature just enough to give it one attraction the more, this elegant Jesus became all the fashion. But Madame Guyon, whose source was above all Saint Teresa, who taught the mystical theory of love, and familiar intercourse with heaven, raised the opposition of the whole clergy who abominated mysticism without understanding it. She exasperated the terrible Bossuet, who accused her of the fashionable heresy, Molinism and Quietism. She refuted, unhappy as she was, this trouble without much difficulty, but he persecuted her for it none the less. He was furious against her, and had her imprisoned at Vincennes, revealed himself obstinate, surly, and atrocious. Fenelon, who tried to conciliate these two tendencies in preparing a small mysticism neither too hot nor too cold, a little less lukewarm than that of Saint Francis de Sales, and above all things much less ardent than that of Saint Teresa, ended in his turn by displeasing the Cormorant of Meaux, and though he abandoned and denied Madame de Guyon, whose friend he had been for long years, he was persecuted and tracked down by Bossuet, condemned at Rome, and sent in exile to Cambrai. And here Durtal could not but smile, for he remembered the desolate complaints of his partisans weeping for this disgrace. Representing thus as a martyr this archbishop whose punishment consisted in quitting his post as courtier at Versailles, to go at last and administer his diocese, in which he appeared till then to have never resided. This mitred Job, who remained in his misfortune Archbishop and Duke of Cambrai, Prince of the Holy Roman Empire, and rich, so unhappy because he was obliged to visit his flock, well shows the state of the episcopate under the redundant reign of the great king. It was a priesthood of financiers and valets. Only there was, at any rate, a certain attraction. There was talent in every case. While now bishops are not for the most part less intriguing nor less servile, but they have no longer either talent or manners. Caught in part in the fish-pond of bad priests, they show themselves ready for everything, and turn out to be souls of old usurers, low jobbers, beggars, when you press them. "It is sad to say it, but so it is," concluded Durtal. "As for Madame Guyon," he went on, "she was neither an original writer nor a saint. She was only an unwelcome substitute for the true mystics. She was presuming, and certainly lacked that humility which magnified Saint Teresa and Saint Clare. But after all she burst into a flame, she was overcome by Jesus. Above all, she was not a pious courtier, a bigot softened by a court like the Maintenon. After all, what a time for religion it was! All its saints have something formal and restricted, wordy and cold, which turns me away from them. Saint Francis de Sales, Saint Vincent de Paul, Saint Chantal,
No, I prefer St. Francis of Assisi, St. Bernard, St. Angela. The mysticism of the 17th century is all the fashion, with its emphatic and mean churches, its pompous and icy painting, its solemn poetry, its gloomy prose. But look," he said, "my cell is still neither swept nor set in order, and I am afraid that in lingering here I may give some trouble to Father Etienne. It rains, however, too hard to allow of my walking in the wood. The simplest thing is to go and read the little office of Our Lady in the chapel." He went down there. It was at this hour almost empty. The monks were at work in the fields or in the factory. 2 fathers only, on their knees before the altar of Our Lady, were praying so absorbedly that they did not even hear the opening of the door. And Durtal, who had placed himself near them opposite the porch which gave upon the high altar, saw them reflected in the sheet of glass, placed before the shrine of the Blessed Guéry. This sheet had indeed the effect of a mirror, and the white fathers were in the depths of it, lived in prayers under the table, in the very heart of the altar. And he also appeared there in a corner, reflected, at the back of the shrine, near the sacred remains of the monk. At one moment he lifted his head, and saw that the round window in the apse, behind the altar, reproduced on its glass ornamented with grey and blue, the marks engraved on the reverse of the medal of Saint Benedict, the first letters of its imperative formulas, the initials of its distiches. It might have been called an immense clear medal, sifting a pale light, straining it through prayers, not allowing them to penetrate to the altar till sanctified and blessed by the Patriarch. And while he was dreaming, the clock struck. The 2 Trappists regained their stalls, while the others entered. Waiting thus in the chapel, the hour of sext had struck. The abbot advanced. Durtal saw him again for the first time since their conversation. He seemed less ill, less pale. He marched majestically in his great white cowl, at the hood of which hung a violet acorn, and the fathers bowed, kissing their sleeve before him. He reached his place, which was designated by a wooden cross standing before a stall, and all enfolded themselves with a great sign of the cross, bowed to the altar, and the feeble imploring voice of the old Trappist rose, Deus in adjutorum meum intende. And the office continued, in the monotonous and charming pitch of the doxology, interrupted by profound reverences, large movements of the arm lifting the sleeve of the cowl as it fell to the ground, to allow the hand freedom to turn the pages. When sext was over, Durtal went to rejoin the oblate. They found on the table of the refectory a little omelette, leeks cooked in a sauce of flour and oil, haricots and cheese. "It is astonishing," said Durtal, "how in regard to mystics the world errs on preconceived ideas, on the old string. Phrenologists declare that mystics have pointed skulls. Now here, that their form is more visible than elsewhere, because they are all hairless and shaven, there are no more heads like eggs than anywhere else. I looked this morning at the shape of their heads, no 2 are alike. Some are oval and depressed, others like a pear and straight, some have lumps on them, and some have none. And it is just the same with faces. When they are not transfigured by prayer, they are ordinary. If they did not wear the habit of their order, no one could recognize in these Trappists predestined beings living out of modern society, in the full Middle Ages, in absolute dependence on a God. If they have souls which are not like those of other people, they have, after all, faces and bodies like those of the first comer." "All is within," said the oblate. "Why should elect souls be enclosed in fleshly prisons different to others?" This conversation, which continued on different points of Trappist life, ended by turning on death in a monastery, and M. Bruno revealed some details. "When death is near," he said, "the Father Abbot traces on the ground a cross in blessed ashes covered with straw, and the dying man is placed on it, wrapped in serge cloth. The brothers recite near him the prayers of the dying, and at the moment of his death the response, Subvenite Sancti Dei, is chanted in choir. The Father Abbot incenses the body, which is washed while the monks sing the office of the dead in another room. Then his regular habit is put on the dead monk, and he is borne in procession to the church, where he lies on a stretcher with his face uncovered, until the hour destined for the funeral. Then, on the way to the cemetery, the community intones no longer the chant of the dead, the psalms of grief, and the sequences of regret, but rather, In exitu Israel de Aegypto, which is the psalm of deliverance, the free song of joy. And the Trappist is buried without a coffin, in his robe of stuff, his head covered with his hood. Lastly, during 30 days, his place remains empty in the refectory, his portion is served as usual, but the brother porter distributes it to the poor." "Ah, the happiness to die thus," said the oblate, as he ended. "For if one dies after having honestly fulfilled one's task in the order, one is assured of eternal happiness, according to the promises made by our Lord to Saint Benedict and to Saint Bernard." "The rain is over," said Durtal. "I should like to visit today that little chapel at the end of the park of which you spoke to me the other day. Which is the shortest way to reach it?" Monsieur Bruno told him the way, and Durtal went off, rolling a cigarette, to gain the great pond. Thence he struck a path to the left and mounted a lane of trees. He slipped on the wet ground and got on with difficulty. At last, however, he gained a clump of chestnuts, which he skirted. Behind these rose a dwarf tower topped by a very small dome, pierced by a door. To the left and right of this door, on sockets where ornaments of the Romanesque epoch still were seen under the velvety crust of moss, 2 stone angels were still standing. They belonged evidently to the Burgundian school, with their big round heads, their hair puffed and divided into waves, their fat faces with turned-up noses, their solid draperies with hard folds. They also came from the ruins of the old cloister, but the interior of the chapel was unfortunately thoroughly modern. It was so small that the feet of him who knelt at the altar almost touched the wall at the entrance. In a niche veiled by white gauze a virgin smiled with extended hands. She had blue plaster eyes and apple-shaped cheeks. She was wearisome in her insignificance, but her sanctuary retained the warmth of places always shut up. The walls, hung with red calico, were dusted, the floor was swept, and the holy water basins full. Superb tea roses flourished in pots between the candelabra. Durtal then understood why he had so often seen Monsieur Bruno walking in this direction with flowers in his hand. He was going to pray in this place, which he loved, no doubt, because it was isolated in the profound solitude of this Trappist monastery. "Excellent man!" cried Durtal, thinking over the affectionate services, the fraternal care the oblate had had for him. And he added, "He is a happy man too, for he is self-contained, and lives so placidly here. And indeed," he went on, "where is the good of striving, if not against oneself? To agitate oneself for money, for glory, to conduct oneself so as to keep others down, and gain adulation from them, how vain a task! Only the Church, in decking the temporary altars of the liturgical year, in forcing the seasons to follow step by step the life of Christ, has known how to trace for us a plan of necessary occupations, of useful ends. She has given us the means of walking always side by side with Jesus, to live day by day with the Gospels. For Christians she has made time the messenger of sorrows and the herald of joys. She has entrusted to the year the part of servant of the New Testament, the zealous emissary of worship." And Durtal reflected on the cycle of the liturgy which begins on the first day of the religious year, with Advent, then turns with an insensible movement on itself till it returns again to its starting point, to the time when the Church prepares by penitence and prayer to celebrate Christmas. And turning over his prayer book, seeing the extraordinary circle of offices, he thought of that prodigious jewel, that crown of King Recceswint, preserved in the Museum of Cluny. The liturgical year was, like it, studded with crystals and jewels, by its admirable canticles and its fervent hymns set in the very gold of benedictions and vespers. It seemed that the Church had substituted for that crown of thorns with which the Jews had surrounded the temples of the Saviour, the truly royal crown of the Proper of the Seasons, the only one which was chiselled in a metal precious enough, with art pure enough to dare to place itself on the brow of a god. And the grand lapidary had begun his work by incrusting, in this diadem of offices, the hymn of Saint Ambrose, and the invocation taken from the Old Testament, the Rorate Coeli, that melodious chant of expectation and regret, that obscure gem violet-coloured. The lustre declares itself then, when after each of its stanzas rises the solemn prayer of the patriarchs, calling for the longed-for presence of Christ. And the 4 Sundays of Advent disappeared with the turned pages of the prayer book. The night of the Nativity was come. After the Jesu Redemptor of Vespers, the old Portuguese chant, the Adeste Fideles, arose at benediction from every lip. It was a sequence of a truly charming simplicity, an old carving wherein defiled the shepherds and the kings to a popular air appropriate to great marches, apt to charm, to aid by the somewhat military rhythm of its steps the long lines of the faithful quitting their cottages to go to the distant churches in the towns. And imperceptibly, like the year in an invisible rotation, the circle turned, and stopped at the feast of the Holy Innocents, where there flourished out, like a flower from a slaughter-house, on a shoot culled from a soil irrigated by the blood of lambs, this sequence, red and smelling of roses, the Salvete Flores Martyrum of Prudentius. The crown moved again, and the hymn of the Epiphany, the Crudelis Herodes of Sedulius, appeared in its turn. Now the Sundays grew heavy, the violet Sundays, when the Gloria in Excelsis is no more heard, when the Audi Benigne of St. Ambrose is chanted, and the Miserere, that cinder-coloured psalm, which is perhaps the most perfect masterpiece which the Church has ever drawn from her storehouses of plain chants. It was Lent, when the amethysts fade in the moist grey of onyxes, in the embrowned white of quartz, and the magnificent invocation, Attende Domine, rose beneath the arches. Sprung like the Rorate Coeli from the sequences of the Old Testament, this humble and contrite chant, enumerating the deserved punishments of sins, became, if not more sorrowful, at all events more grave and more pressing when it resumed in the initial stanza of its burthen, the avowal of shame already confessed. And suddenly on this crown there burst out after the expiring fires of Lent the flaming ruby of the Passion. On the upturned yellow of the sky a red cross was raised, while majestic shouts and despairing cries proclaimed the blood-stained fruit of the tree, and the Vexilla Regis was again repeated the following Sunday at the Feast of Palms, which joined to that sequence of Fortunatus the green hymn which it accompanied with a silky noise of palms, the Gloria Laus et Honor of Theodulf. Then the fires of precious stones grew grey and died. To the glowing coals of gems succeeded the dead cinders of obsidians, black stones scarcely swelling, without a gleam above the tarnished gold of their mountings. One entered now Holy Week. Everywhere the Pange Lingua and the Stabat Mater wailed under the arches. And then came the Tenebrae, the Lamentations and the Psalms, whose knell shook the flame of the brown waxen tapers. And after each halt, at the end of each of the Psalms, one of the tapers expired, and its column of blue smoke evaporated still under the lighted circumference of the arches, while the choir recommenced the interrupted series of complaints. And the crown turned once more, the beads of this musical rosary still ran on, and all changed. Jesus had risen, and songs of joy issued from the organs. The Victimae Paschale Laudes exulted before the gospel of the masses, and at the benediction of the O Filii et Filiae, created indeed to be intoned by the wild jubilation of crowds, ran and sported in the joyous hurricane of the organs, which uprooted the pillars and unroofed the naves. And the feasts rung in with bells followed at longer intervals. At Ascension the heavy and clear crystals of Saint Ambrose filled with their luminous water the tiny basin of the gem sockets. The fire of rubies and garnets were lighted up again with the crimson hymn and scarlet sequence of Pentecost, the Veni Creator and Veni Spiritus. The feast of the Trinity passed, signalized by the stanzas of Gregory the Great, and for the feast of the Blessed Sacrament, the liturgy could exhibit the most marvellous jewel case of its dower, the office of Saint Thomas, the Pange Lingua, the Adoro Te, the Sacre Solemnis, the Verbum Supernum, and above all the Laudacion, that pure masterpiece of Latin poetry and scholasticism, that hymn so precise, so lucid in its abstraction, so firm in its rhymed words, round which is rolled the melody perhaps the most enthusiastic, the most supple in plain chant. The circle displaced itself again, showing on its different faces the 23 to 28 Sundays which defile after Pentecost, the green weeks of the time of pilgrimage, and stopped at the last feast, at the Sunday after the Octave of All Saints, at the dedication of churches which the Caelistis Urbs incensed, old stanzas of which the ruins were badly consolidated by the architects of Urban VIII, old jewels on which the troubled water slept and was reanimated only in rare lights. The juncture of the religious crown, of the liturgical year, was then made at the Masses, in which the Gospel of the last Sunday after Pentecost, the Gospel according to St. Matthew, repeats, as well as the Gospel according to St. Luke, recited on the first Sunday in Advent, the terrible predictions of Christ on the desolation of the time, on the end of the world. "This is not all," Durtal continued, who was interested in this run through his prayer book.
In this crown of the proper of the seasons are inserted, like smaller stones, the sequences of the proper of saints, which fill the empty places, and finish the round of the circle. First, the pearls and gems of the Blessed Virgin, the limpid jewels, the blue sapphires and rose rubies of her antiphons. Then the aquamarine, so lucid and pure, of the Ave Maris Stella, the topaz, pale as tears, of the O Quod Undis Lacrimarum, on the Feast of the Seven Dolours, the hyacinth, colour of dried blood, of the Stabat. Then were told the feasts of the angels and the saints, the hymns dedicated to the apostles and the evangelists, to the martyrs, whether solitary or in couples, both out of and during the Paschal season, to the confessors, pontiffs and non-pontiffs, to virgins, to holy women, all feasts differentiated by special sequences, by special proses, of which some are very simple, like those stanzas made in honour of the Nativity of St. John the Baptist by Paul the Deacon. There still remains All Saints, with the Placare Christe and the 3 blows on the alarm bell, the knell in triplets of the Dies Irae, which resounds on the day set apart for the commemoration of the dead. "What an immense fund of poetry, what an incomparable estate of art the Church possesses!" he cried, closing his book, and many memories rose for him at this excursion into his prayer book. On how many evenings had the sadness of life been dissipated in listening to these proses chanted in the churches! He thought over again of the suppliant voice of Advent, and recalled one evening when he had wandered under a fine rain along the quays. He had been driven from home by ignoble visions, and at the same time had been harassed by the increasing disgust of his vices. He had ended by being brought up against his will at Saint-Gervais. In the chapel of the Virgin, some poor women were prostrate. He had knelt, tired and dazed, his soul so ill at ease that he slumbered without power to wake himself. Some men and boys of the choir were installed in the chapel with 2 or 3 priests. They had lighted candles, and the voice, light and sustained, of a child, had in the dark of the church chanted the long antiphons of the Rorate. In the state of overwhelming sadness in which he was stagnant, Durtal felt himself open and bleeding to the bottom of his soul. Then a voice older and less trembling, which understood the words it said, narrated ingenuously, almost without confusion, to the Just One, "Peccavimus et facti sumus tanquam immundus nos." And Durtal took up these words, and spelt them over in terror, thinking, "Ah, yes, we have sinned and become like the leprous, O Lord." And the chant continued, and in his turn, the Most High borrowed that same innocent organ of childhood to declare to man his pity, and to confirm to him the pardon assured by the coming of the Son. And the evening had ended by the benediction in plain chant, in the midst of the silence and prostration of unhappy women. Durtal remembered how he left the church refreshed, freed from his hauntings, and he had gone away in the drizzling rain, surprised that the way was so short, humming the Rorate, of which the air had taken possession of him, ending by seeing in it the personal touch of a kindly unknown. And there were other evenings. The octave of the Feast of All Souls at Saint-Sulpice and at St. Thomas Aquinas, where, after the Vespers of the Dead, they brought out again the old sequence which has disappeared from the Roman breviary, the Languentibus in Purgatorio. This church was the only one in Paris which had retained these pages of the Gallican hymnal, and had them sung by 2 basses without a choir. But these singers, so poor as a rule, no doubt were fond of this air, for if they did not sing it with art, at least they put a little soul into its delivery. And this invocation to the Madonna, in which she was adjured to save the souls in purgatory, was as sorrowful as the souls themselves, and so melancholy, so languid, that the surroundings were forgotten. The ugliness of that sanctuary of which the choir was a theatre scene, surrounded by closed dressing-rooms and garnished with lustres. One might think oneself for a few moments far from Paris, far from that population of devout women and servant girls, which attend that place in the evening. "Ah, the church," he said to himself as he descended the path which led to the great pond, "what a mother of art is she!" And suddenly the noise of a body falling into the water interrupted his reflections. He looked behind the hedge of reeds and saw nothing but great circles running on the water. And all at once in one of these rings a small dog-like head appeared holding a fish in its mouth. The beast raised itself a little out of the water, showed a thin body covered with fur, and gazed on Durtal quietly with its little black eyes. Then in a flash it passed the distance which separated it from the bank, and disappeared under the grasses.
"It is the otter," he said to himself, remembering the discussion at table between the stranger priest and the oblate. And he went to gain the other pond when he encountered Father Etienne. He told him his adventure. "Impossible!" cried the monk. "No one has ever seen the otter. You must have mistaken it for a water rat or some other animal, for that beast, for which we have watched for years, is invisible." Durtal gave him a description of it. "It is certainly the otter," admitted the guest master, surprised. It was evident that this otter lived in the pond in a legendary state. In monotonous lives, in days like those in a cloister, it took the proportions of a fabulous subject, of an event whereof the mystery would occupy intervals seized between prayers and offices. "We must point out to M. Bruno the exact spot where you remarked it, for he will begin to hunt it again," said Father Etienne after a silence. "But how can it trouble you in eating your fish, since you do not angle for them?" "I beg your pardon. We fish for them to send them to the Archbishop," answered the monk, who went on. "Still, it is very strange that you saw the beast." "When I leave this," thought Durtal, "they will certainly speak of me as the gentleman who saw the otter." While talking they had arrived at the cross pond. "Look," said the father, pointing out the swan, who rose in a fury, beat his wings and hissed. "What is the matter with him?" "The matter is that the white hue of my habit infuriates him." "Ah! And why?" "I do not know. Perhaps he wants to be the only one who is white here. He spares the lay brothers, while as for a father... Wait, you will see." And the guest master walked quietly towards the swan. "Come," he said to the angry creature, who splashed him with water, and he held out his hand, which the swan snapped. "See," said the monk, showing the mark of a red pinch printed on the flesh. And he smiled, holding his hand, and quitted Durtal, who asked himself whether, in acting thus, the Trappist were not wishing to inflict on himself some corporal punishment to atone for some distraction the evening before, some peccadillo. That stroke of the beak must have pinched him horribly, for the tears came into his eyes. How could he expose himself with joy to such a bite? And he remembered that one day at the office of none, one of the young monks made a mistake in the tone of an antiphon. At the moment that the office ended, he knelt before the altar. Then he lay his whole length on the tiles on his face, his mouth pressed on the ground, till the stroke of the prior's bell gave him the order to get up. This was a voluntary punishment for a negligence committed, a forgetfulness. Who knows whether Father Etienne did not in his turn punish himself for a thought he deemed to border on sin, in getting himself thus pinched? He consulted the oblate on the point in the evening, but M. Bruno contented himself with a smile, without answering. And when Durtal spoke to him of his speedy departure for Paris, the old man shook his head. "Considering," he said, "the fear and the discomfort that communion caused you, you would act wisely if you approached the holy table immediately on your return." And seeing that Durtal did not reply, but hung his head, "Believe a man who has known these trials. If you do not force yourself while you are still under the warm impression of La Trappe, you will float between desire and regret without advancing. You will be ingenious in discovering excuses for not making your confession. You will try to think it impossible to find in Paris an abbé who understands you. Now, allow me to assure you nothing is more false. If you desire an expert and easy confidant, go to the Jesuits. If you wish above all a zealous-souled priest, go to Saint-Sulpice. You will find there honest and intelligent ecclesiastics, excellent hearts. In Paris, where the clergy of the parishes are so mixed, they are at the top of the basket of the priesthood, and, as may be imagined, they form a community, live in cells, do not dine out. And as the Sulpician rule forbids them to aspire to honours or places, they do not run the chance of becoming bad priests by ambition. Do you know them?" "No. But to resolve that question, which in fact constantly troubles me, I count on a priest whom I often see, on the very man who, in fact, sent me into this Trappist monastery. And that," he went on, "makes me remember," and he rose to go to Compline, "that I have as yet forgotten to write to him. It is true that now it is too late. I should arrive at his house almost as soon as my letter. It is strange, but by force of walking in one's own, by force of living to oneself, the days run by, and there is no time to do anything here." End of Part 2, Chapter 7.
Part 2, Chapter 8 of En route by Joris-Karl HUYSMANS. Translated by Charles Kegan Paul. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. He had hoped for his last day at La Trappe a morning of quiet, when his mind might lounge, a mixture of spiritual siesta and of working, charmed by a round of officers, and not at all that the idea persistent and obstinate that he must quit the monastery next day would spoil all the pleasures he had promised himself. Now that he had no longer to cleanse himself and pass under the winnowing of confession, to present himself for the communion in the morning, he remained irresolute, not knowing any longer how to occupy his time, terrified by the recommencement of that life of the world which would upset all the barriers of forgetfulness, and would get at him at once above all the broken defences of the cloister. Like a captured animal, he began to rub against the bars of his cage, made the tour of the enclosure, filling his sight with those places where he had tasted hours so kindly and so cruel. He felt in himself a shaking of the ground, a disturbance of soul, an absolute discouragement before the prospect of re-entering into his habitual existence, of mixing himself anew with the coming and going of men, and he experienced at the same time a great fatigue of brain. He dragged himself along the walls in a state of complete discomfort, in one of those attacks of religious spleen which determine, while they last during years, the taedium vitae of the cloisters. He had a horror of any life but this, and the soul overwrought by prayers was failing in a body insufficiently rested and ill-nourished. It had no further desire, asked only to be let alone, to sleep, to fall into one of those states of torpor in which everything becomes indifferent, in which one ends by losing consciousness gently, by being stifled without suffering. He might well, to react on him as a consolation, promise himself to assist in Paris at the offices of the Benedictine nuns, that he would keep himself on the outskirts of society, to himself. And he was at once obliged to answer that these subterfuges are impossible, that the very movement of the town is against all decoys, that isolation in a chamber is in no degree like the solitude of a cell, that masses celebrated in a chapel open to the public cannot be likened to the private offices of the Trappists. Then what is the good of trying to misunderstand? It is with the soul as with the body, which is better on the seashore, or in the mountains, than shut up in a town. There is a better spiritual air even at Paris, in certain religious quarters of the left bank, than in the districts situated on the other bank, more lively in certain churches, more pure, for example, at Notre-Dame-des-Victoires than in churches such as La Trinité and the Madeleine. But the monastery was, as it were, the true shore and high plateau of the soul. There the atmosphere was balsamic, strength returned, lost appetite for God was there recovered, there was health succeeding weakness, a regimen fortified and sustained instead of languor and the restricted exercises of the towns. The conviction that no trickery was possible to him at Paris brought him to the ground. He wandered from cell to chapel, from chapel to woods, awaiting the dinner hour with impatience, in order to be able to speak to someone, for in his disorder a new need arose. For more than a week he had spent the whole afternoon without opening his lips. He did not suffer from it, was even satisfied with his silence, but since he was pressed by this idea of departure, he could not keep silence any longer, thought aloud in the walks to assuage the sensations of his swelling heart, that stifled him. M. Bruno was too sagacious not to guess the uneasiness of his companion, who became by turns taciturn and over-talkative during the meal. He made, however, as though he saw nothing, but after he had said grace he disappeared, and Durtal, who was strolling near the great pond, was surprised to see him coming in his direction with Father Etienne. They greeted him, and the Trappist with a smile proposed to him, if he had made no other plan, to pass his time in visiting the convent, and especially the library, which the Father Prior would be delighted to show him. "If convenient to me, I shall be delighted," cried Durtal. All three returned towards the abbey. The monk lifted the latch of a little door fashioned in a wall near the church, and Durtal entered a minute cemetery, planted with wooden crosses on grass graves. There was no inscription, no flower in this enclosure which they traversed. The monk pushed another door, which opened on a long corridor smelling of rats. At the end of this gallery, Durtal recognized the staircase he had ascended one morning for his confession in the prior's room. They left it on their right, turned into another gallery, and the guest-master led them into an immense hall, pierced by high windows, decorated with 18th-century pier-glasses and grisailles. It was furnished only with benches and stalls, above which was a single chair sculptured and painted with abbatial arms, which marked the place of Don Anselme. "Oh, this chapter house has nothing monastic," said Father Etienne, designating the profane pictures on the walls. "We have kept just as it was the drawing-room of this old chateau, but I beg you to believe that this decoration hardly pleases us." "And what takes place in this hall?" "Well, we meet here after Mass. The chapter opens by reading the Martyrology, followed by the concluding prayers of Prime. Then we read a passage from the Rule, and the Father Abbot comments on it. Lastly, we practice the exercise of humility, that is to say, that whoever among us has committed any fault against the Rule prostrates himself and avows it before his brethren." They went thence to the refectory. This room had also a high ceiling, but was smaller, and garnished with tables in the form of a horseshoe. A kind of large cruets, each containing 2 half bottles of wine and water, separated by a water bottle, and before them, instead of glasses, cups of brown earthenware, with 2 handles, were placed at equal distances. The monk explained that these sham cruets, with 3 branches, indicated the place of 2 covers, each monk having a right to his half bottle of drink, and partaking with his neighbour the water in the bottle. "This pulpit," said Father Etienne, pointing out a large wooden box fixed against the wall, "is destined for the reader of the week, the father who reads during the meal." "How long does the meal last?" "Just half an hour." "Yes, and the cookery which we eat is delicate in comparison with that which is served to the monks," said the oblate. "I should lie if I were to affirm that we make good cheer," answered the guest-master. "Do you know that the hardest thing to bear, in the earlier time especially, is the want of seasoning in our dishes? Pepper and spices are forbidden by our rule, and as no salt cellar has place in our table, we swallow our food just as it is, and it is for the most part scarcely salted. On certain days in summer, when one sweats in big drops, this becomes almost impossible, the gorge rises. Yet one must begin upon this warm paste, and at least swallow a sufficient quantity not to give out before the next day. We look at each other discouraged, unable to get any further. There is not another word to define our dinner in the month of August. It is a punishment. And all, the Father Abbot, the prior, the fathers, the brethren, have the same food?" "All. Now, come and see the dormitory." They ascended to the first floor. An immense corridor, furnished like a stable with wooden boxes, extended before them, closed at each end by a door. "This is our lodging," said the monk, as he stopped before one of these cases. Cards were placed on them, affixing the name of each monk, and the first bore a ticket with this inscription: "The Father Abbot." Durtal felt the bed against one of the 2 walls. It was as rough as a carding comb, and as biting as a file. It was composed of a simple quilted paillasse extended on a plank. No sheets, but a prison coverlet of grey wool, a sack of straw instead of pillows. "God, it is very hard," said Durtal, and the monk laughed. "Our habits soften the roughness of this straw mattress," he said, "for our rule does not allow us to undress, we may only take off our shoes, therefore we sleep entirely clad, our head wrapped in our hood." "And it must be cold in this corridor swept by all the winds," added Durtal. "No doubt the winter is rough here, but it is not that season which alarms us. We live pretty well, even without fire in time of frost. But the summer! If you knew what it is to wake in habits still steeped in sweat, not dried since the evening before, it is terrible." "Then, though because of the great heat we have often hardly slept, we must before dawn jump out of bed, and begin at once the great night office, the vigils, which last at least 2 hours. Even after 20 years of Trappist life, one cannot but suffer at that getting up. In chapel you fight against sleep which crushes you, you sleep while you hear a verse chanted, you strive to keep awake in order to be able to chant another, and fall asleep again. One ought to be able to turn the key on thought, and one is incapable of it. Truly, I assure you that even beyond the corporal fatigue which explains that state in the morning, there is then an aggression of the demon, an incessant temptation to make us recite the office badly." "And you all undergo this strife?" "All. And this does not hinder," concluded the monk, whose face was radiant, "this does not hinder us from being very happy here. Because all these trials are nothing beside the deep and intimate joys which our good God gives us.
Ah, he is a generous master. He pays us 100-fold for our poor sorrows." As they spoke, they had passed through the corridor and had arrived at its other end. The monk opened the door, and Durtal was astounded to find himself in a vestibule just opposite his own cell. "I did not think," he said, "that I was living so near you." "This house is a regular labyrinth, but M. Bruno will take you to the library where the Father Prior is waiting for you, for I must go to my business. We shall meet presently," he said with a smile. The library was situated on the other side of the staircase by which Durtal reached his chamber. It was large, furnished with shelves from top to bottom, occupied in the middle by a sort of counter-table on which also were spread rows of books. Father Maximin said to Durtal, "We are not very rich, but at any rate we possess tools for work fairly complete on theology and the monography of the cloisters." "You have superb volumes," cried Durtal, who looked at magnificent folios in splendid bindings with armorial bearings. "Wait, here are the works of Saint Bernard in a fine edition," and the monk presented to Durtal enormous volumes, printed in heavy letters on crackling paper. "When I think that I promised myself to make acquaintance with Saint Bernard in this very abbey which he founded, and here I am on the eve of my departure, and have read nothing." "You do not know his works?" "Yes, scattered fragments of his sermons and of his letters. I have run through some selectae mediocres of his works, but that is all." "He is our chief master here, but he is not the only one of our ancestors in Saint Benedict whom the convent possesses," said the monk with a certain pride. "See," and he pointed out on the shelves some heavy folios, "here, Saint Gregory the Great, Venerable Bede, Saint Peter Damian, Saint Anselm, and your friends are there," he said, following Durtal with a glance as he read the titles of the volumes, "Saint Teresa, Saint John of the Cross, Saint Magdalene of Pazzi, Saint Angela, Tauler, and she who like Sister Emmerich dictated her conversations with Jesus during her ecstasy." And the prior took from the range of books in octavo the Dialogues of Saint Catherine of Siena. "That Dominican nun is terrible for the priests of her time," the monk went on. "She insists on their misdeeds, reproaches them roundly with selling the Holy Spirit, with practising sortilege, and with using the sacrament to compose evil charms. And there are, besides, the disorderly vices of which she accuses them in the series concerning the sin of the flesh," added the oblate. "Certainly, she does not mince her words, but she had the right to take up that tone, and menace in the name of the Lord, for she was truly inspired by him. Her doctrine was drawn from divine sources. Doctrina eius infusa non acquisita, says the Church in the bull of her canonization. Her dialogues are admirable, the pages in which God exposes the holy frauds which he sometimes uses to recall men to good, the passages in which she treats of the monastic life, of that barque which possesses 3 ropes, chastity, obedience, and poverty, and which faces the tempest under the conduct of the Holy Spirit, are delightful. She reveals herself in her work the pupil of the well-beloved disciple, and of St. Thomas Aquinas. One might believe that one heard the angel of the school paraphrasing the last of the evangelists. "Yes," said the oblate, striking in, "if St. Catherine of Siena does not give herself to the high speculations of mysticism, if she does not analyze, like St. Teresa, the mysteries of divine love, nor trace the itinerary of souls destined to the perfect life, she reflects directly at least the conversations of heaven. She calls, she loves. You have read, sir, her treatises on discretion and prayer?" "No, I have read St. Catherine of Genoa, but the books of St. Catherine of Siena have never fallen into my hands." "And what do you think of this collection?" Durtal looked at the title and made a face. "I see that Suso hardly delights you." "I should tell a lie if I assured you that the dissertations of this Dominican pleased me. First, however illuminated the man may be, he does not attract me. Without speaking of the frenzy of his penances, what scrupulousness of devotion and narrowness of piety was his! Think that he could not decide on drinking till he had first, as a preliminary, divided his beverage into 5 parts. He thought thus to honour the 5 wounds of the Saviour, and moreover he swallowed his last mouthful in 2 gulps, to call up before himself the water and the blood which flowed from the side of the Word. No, these sort of things would never enter into my head. I would never admit that such practices would glorify Christ. And remark well that this love of pounding things small, this passion for small blessings, is found in all his work. His God is so difficult to content, so scrupulous, so meddling, that no one would ever get to heaven, if they believed what he said. This God of his is the fault-finder of eternity, the miser of paradise. On the whole, Suso expands himself in impetuous discourses on trifles. Then what with his insipid allegories, his morose colloquy on the 9 rocks, knocks me down. You will, however, admit that his study on the union of the soul is substantial, and that the office of the eternal wisdom which he composed is worth reading? I cannot say, Father, I do not now remember that office, but I recollect tolerably well the treatise on union with God. It seems to me more interesting than the rest, but you will admit that it is very short. And then Saint Teresa has also elucidated that question of human renunciation and divine fruition. And, hang it then! Come, said the oblate with a smile, I give up the attempt to make you a fervent reader of the good Suso. For us, said Father Maximin, if we had a little time to work, this ought to be the leaven of our meditations, the subject of our reading. And he took down a folio which contained the works of St. Hildegard, abbess of the convent of Rupertsberg. She, you see, is the great prophetess of the New Testament. Never, since the visions of St. John at Patmos, has the Holy Spirit communicated to an earthly being with such fullness and light. In her Heptachronon she predicts Protestantism and the captivity of the Vatican. In her Scivias, or Knowledge of the Ways of the Lord, which was edited according to her recital by a monk of the convent of Saint Désibode, she interprets the symbols of the Scriptures and even the nature of the elements. She also wrote a diligent commentary on our rules, and enthusiastic pages on sacred music, on literature, on art, which she defines admirably, a reminiscence, half effaced, of a primitive condition from which we have fallen since Eden. Unfortunately, to understand her it is necessary to give oneself to minute researches and patient studies. Her apocalyptic style has something retractile, which retreats and shuts itself up all the more when one will open it. I am well aware that I am losing my little Latin, said M. Bruno. What a pity there is not a translation of her works, with glosses to help. They are untranslatable, said the father, who went on. St. Hildegard is, with St. Bernard, one of the purest glories of the family of St. Benedict. How predestinate was that virgin, who was inundated with interior light at the age of 3, and died at 82, having lived all her life in the cloister. And add that she was as a permanent state prophetical, cried the oblate. She is like no other woman saint. All in her is astonishing, even the way in which God addresses her, for he forgets that she is a woman and calls her man. And she, added the prior, employs, when she wishes to designate herself, the singular expression, the paltry form. But here is another writer who is dear to us, and he showed Durtal the 2 volumes of St. Gertrude. She is again one of our great nuns, an abbess truly Benedictine, in the exact sense of the word, for she caused the Holy Scriptures to be explained to her nuns, wished that the piety of her daughters should be based on science, that this faith should be sustained by liturgical food, if I may say so. I know nothing of her but her exercises, observed Durtal, and they have left me with the memory of echoed words, of things said again from the sacred books. So far as one may judge from simple extracts, she does not appear to have original expression, and to be far below Saint Teresa or Saint Angela. No doubt, answered the monk, but she comes near Saint Angela by the gift of familiarity when she converses with Christ, and also by the loving vehemence of what she says. Only all this is transformed on leaving its proper source. She thinks liturgically, and this is so true that the least of her reflections at once presents itself to her clothed in the language of the Gospels and the Psalms. Her revelations, her insinuations, her herald of divine love, are marvellous from this point of view. And then her prayer to the Blessed Virgin is exquisite, which opens with this phrase, "Hail, O white lily of the Trinity, resplendent and always at rest." As a continuation of her works, the Benedictine Fathers of Solesmes have edited also the Revelations of Saint Mechtilde, her book on Special Grace and her Light of the Divinity. They are there on that shelf. "Let me show you," said in his turn M. Bruno, "guides wisely marked out for the soul which escapes from itself, and will attempt to climb the eternal mountains." And he handed to Durtal the Lucerna Mystica of Lopez Ezquerra, the quartos of Scaramelli, the volumes of Schramm,
the Christian asceticism of Ribet, the principles of mystic theology of Father Seraphin.
And do you know this?
Continued the oblate. The volume he offered was called On Prayer, was anonymous, and bore at the bottom of its first page, Solem, printed at the Abbey of St. Cecilia, and above the printed date, 1886, Durtal made out the word written in ink, Confidential. I have never seen this little book, which seems moreover to have never been brought into the market. Who is the author?
The most extraordinary nun of our time, the abbess of the Benedictine nuns at Solesmes. I regret only that you are going so soon, for I should have been happy to let you read it. As far as the document is concerned, it is of a most extraordinary science, and it contains admirable quotations from St. Hildegard and Cassien. As far as mysticism is concerned, Mother St. Cecilia evidently only reproduces the works of her predecessors, and she tells us nothing very new. Nevertheless, I remember a passage which seems to me more special, more personal. Wait. And the oblate turned over a few pages. Here it is. The spiritualized soul does not appear exposed to temptation properly so called, but by a divine permission it is called upon to conflict with the demon, spirit against spirit. The contact with the demon is then perceived on the surface of the soul, under the form of a burn at once spiritual and sensible. If the soul hold good in its union with God, if it be strong, the pain, however sharp, is bearable. But if the soul commit any slight imperfection, even inwardly, the demon makes just so much way, and carries his horrible burning more forward, until by generous acts the soul can repulse him further. This touch of Satan, which produces an almost material effect on the most intangible parts of our being, is, you will admit, at least curious, concluded the oblate as he closed the volume. Mother St. Cecilia is a remarkable strategist of the soul, said the prior, but this work which she edited for the daughters of her abbey contains, I think, some rash propositions which have not been read without displeasure at Rome. To have done with our poor treasures, he continued, we have only on this side, and he pointed out a portion of the bookcases which covered the room, long-winded works, the Cistercian Menology, Migne's Patrology, Dictionaries of the Lives of the Saints, Manuals of Sacred Interpretation, Canon Law, Christian Apology, Biblical Exegesis, the complete works of Saint Thomas, tools of work which we rarely employ, for as you know we are a branch of the Benedictine trunk vowed to a life of bodily labour and penance. We are men of sorrow for God, above all things. Here is M. Bruno who uses these books, and so do I at times, for I have special charge of spiritual matters in this monastery, added the monk with a smile. Durtal looked at him. He handled the volumes with caressing hands, brooded over them with the blue lustre of his eye, laughed with the joy of a child as he turned their pages. What a difference between this monk who evidently adores his books and the prior with his imperious profile and silent lips who heard his confession the second day. Then thinking of all these Trappists, the severity of their countenances, the joy of their eyes, Durtal said to himself that these Cistercians were not at all as the world believed, solemn and funereal people, but that, quite the contrary, they were the gayest of men. Now, said Father Maximin, the Reverend Father Abbot has charged me with a commission. Knowing that you will leave us tomorrow, he is anxious, now that he is better, to pass at least some minutes with you. He will be free this evening. Will it trouble you to join him after Compline? Not at all. I shall be glad to talk with Don Anselme. That is understood, then. They went downstairs. Durtal thanked the prior, who re-entered the enclosure of the corridors, and the oblate, who went up to his cell. He trifled about, and in spite of the torment of his departure, which haunted him, reached the evening without too much trouble. The Salve Regina, which he heard perhaps for the last time thus sung by male voices, that airy chapel built of sound, and evaporating with the close of the antiphon, in the smoke of the tapers, stirred him to the bottom of his soul. The Trappist monastery showed itself truly charming this evening. After the office they said the rosary, not as at Paris, where they recite a Pater, 10 Aves and a Gloria, and so over again. Here they said in Latin a Pater, an Ave, a Gloria, and began again, until in that manner they had finished several decades. This rosary was said on their knees, half by the prior, half by all the monks. It went at so rapid a pace
that it was scarcely possible to distinguish the words, but as soon as it was ended, at a signal there was a great silence, and each one prayed with his head in his hands. And Durtal took notice of the ingenious system of conventual prayers. After the prayers purely vocal like these, came mental prayer, personal petitions, stimulated and set a-going by the very machine of paternosters. Nothing is left to chance in religion. Every exercise which seems at first useless has a reason for its being, he said to himself, as he went out into the court. And the fact is that the rosary, which seems to be only a humming top of sounds, fulfills an end. It reposes the soul wearied with the supplications which it has recited, applying itself to them, thinking of them. It hinders it from babbling and reciting to God always the same petitions, the same complaints. It allows it to take breath, to take rest, in prayers in which it can dispense with reflection, and in fact the rosary occupies in prayer those hours of fatigue in which one would not pray. Ah, here is the Father Abbot. The Trappist expressed to him his regret at visiting him only thus for a few moments. Then, after he had answered Durtal, who inquired after the state of his health, which he hoped was at last re-established, he proposed to him to walk in the garden, and begged him not to inconvenience himself by not smoking cigarettes, if he had a mind to do so. And the conversation turned on Paris. Dom Anselm asked for some information, and ended by saying with a smile, "I see by scraps of newspapers which come to me that society just now is infected with socialism. Everyone wishes to solve the famous social question. How does that get on?" "How does that get on? Why, not at all. Unless you can change the souls of workmen and masters, and make them disinterested and charitable between today and tomorrow, in what can you expect these systems to end?" "Well," said the monk, enwrapping the monastery with a gesture, "the question is solved here. As wages do not exist, all sources of conflicts are suppressed. As every task is according to aptitudes and powers, the fathers who are not strong-shouldered and big-armed fold the packages of chocolate, or make out the bills, and those who are robust dig the ground. I add that the equality in our cloisters is such that the prior and the abbot have no advantage over the other monks. At table the portions, and in the dormitory the paillasses, are identical. The sole profits of the abbot consist on the whole in the inevitable cares arising from the moral conduct and the temporal administration of an abbey. There is therefore no reason why the workmen of a convent should go on strike," concluded the abbot with a smile. "Yes, but you are minimists, you suppress the family and woman, you live on nothing, and expect the only real recompense for your labours after death. How can you make the people in the towns understand that?" "The social system may thus be summed up, as I think. The masters wish to profit by the workmen, who in their turn desire to be paid as much as possible for as little work as possible. Well, then, there is no way out of that." "Exactly, and there is the sad part of it. For socialism in fact arises from kindly ideas, just ideas, and will always run up against egotism and gain, against the inevitable breakers of the sins of man." "And your little chocolate factory gives you at least some income?" "Yes, that saves us." The abbot was silent for a second. Then he went on. "You know, sir, how a convent is founded. I take, for example, our order. A domain and the lands about it are offered the order on condition that it peoples them. The order takes a handful of its monks and settles them as a swarm on the soil given to it. There its task stops. The grain must spring up of itself, or to put it differently, the Trappists, severed from their mother house, must gain their livelihood and suffice for themselves. So, when we took possession of these buildings, we were so poor that from bread to shoes everything was lacking. But we had no anxiety for the future, for there is no example in monastic history that Providence has not succoured abbeys who trusted in it. Little by little we drew our food from the estate, and we learnt useful trades. Now we make our habits and our shoes. We reap our wheat and make our bread. Our material existence is therefore assured, but the taxes crush us. Therefore we have founded this factory, of which the report becomes better from year to year. In a year or two the building which shelters us, and for want of money we have been unable to repair, will tumble down. But if God then allows generous souls to come to our aid, perhaps we shall be in a condition to build a monastery, which is the wish of all of us. For indeed this hovel with its rooms in confusion, and its rotunda chapel, is painful to us." The abbot was silent again. Then after a pause he said in a low voice, speaking to himself,
It cannot be denied, a convent which has not the look of a cloister is an obstacle to vocations. The postulant has need, and this is quite natural, to mould himself in surroundings which please him, to encourage himself in a church which wraps him round, in a somewhat sombre chapel. And to obtain that result you want the Romanesque or Gothic style. Ah, yes, indeed. And have you many novices? We have especially many subjects who desire to feel the life of Trappists, but the greater part do not succeed in supporting our way of life. Beside even the question of knowing whether the vocation of the beginners is imaginary or real, we are from the physical point of view clearly fixed after a fortnight's trial. Eating vegetables only must crush the most robust constitutions. I do not even understand how, leading an active life, you can bear it. The truth is that bodies obey where souls are resolute. Our ancestors endured the life of the Trappists very well. We want souls at the present day. I remember that when I made my probation in a Cistercian cloister I had no health, and yet had it been necessary I would have eaten stones. Moreover, the rule will soon be softened, pursued the abbot. But in any case, there is a country which, if there should be scarcity, assures us a good number of recruits. Holland. And seeing Durtal's look of astonishment, the father said, "Yes, in that Protestant country mystic vegetation is flourishing. Catholicism is all the more fervent that it is, if not persecuted, at least despised, drowned in the mass of Calvinists. Perhaps this belongs also to the nature of the soil, to its solitary plains, its silent canals, to the very taste of the Dutch for a regular and peaceable life. But in that little knot of Catholics the Cistercian vocation is always very common." Durtal looked at the Trappist as he walked majestic and quiet, his head buried in his hood, his hands passed under his cincture. From time to time his eyes grew bright inside his hood, and the amethyst which he wore on his finger sparkled in brief flames. No sound was heard. At this hour the monastery was asleep. Durtal and the abbot were walking on the banks of the great pond, where the water was alive, it alone wakeful in the slumber of the woods, for the moon, which shone in a cloudless sky, sowed a myriad of goldfish, and this luminous spawn, fallen from the planet, mounted, descended, sparkled in 1,000 little points of fire, of which the wind as it blew increased the brightness. The abbot spoke no longer, and Durtal, who was thinking, intoxicated by the sweetness of the night, groaned suddenly. He had just considered that at this same hour the next day he would be at Paris, and seeing the monastery, whose pale front appeared at the end of a walk as at the end of a dark tunnel, he cried, thinking of all the monks who inhabited it, "Oh, they are happy!" And the abbot answered, "Too happy." Then gently, in a low voice, "Yes, it is true we enter here to do penance, to mortify ourselves, and we have hardly begun to suffer when God consoles us. He is so good that He Himself wishes to deceive Himself about our merits. If at certain moments He allows the demon to persecute us, He gives us in exchange so much happiness that there is no proportion preserved between the recompense and the sorrow. Sometimes when I think of it I ask myself how there still subsists that equilibrium that nuns and monks are charged to maintain, since neither of us suffer enough to neutralize the repeated sins of towns." The abbot stopped, and then went on pensively, "The world does not even conceive that the austerity of the abbeys can profit it. The doctrine of mystical compensation escapes it entirely. It cannot represent to itself that the substitution of the innocent for the guilty is necessary when to suffer merited punishment is concerned. Nor does it explain to itself any more that in wishing to suffer for others, monks turn aside the wrath of heaven and establish a solidarity in the good which is a counterweight against the federation of evil. God knows, moreover, with what cataclysms the unconscious world would be menaced, if in consequence of a sudden disappearance of all the cloisters, the equilibrium which saves it were broken." "The case has already presented itself," said Durtal, who while listening to the Trappist thought of the Abbé Gévresin, and remembered how that priest had expressed himself on the same subject in nearly similar terms. "The Revolution, in fact, suppressed all convents with one stroke of a pen, but I think that the history of that time when so many hucksters were busy is still to be written. Instead of searching for documents on the acts, and even on the persons of the Jacobins, the archives of the religious orders which existed at that time should be ransacked. In working thus at the side of the Revolution, in sounding its neighbourhood, its foundations will be exhumed. Its causes will be brought to the surface, and it will certainly be discovered that in proportion to the suppression of convents, monstrous excesses had birth. Who knows if the demoniacal madness of Carrier or Marat do not accord with the death of an abbey whose sanctity preserved France for years? To be just, answered the abbot, it is right to say that the Revolution destroyed ruins only. The rule of in commendam ended by giving the monasteries over to Satan. It was they, alas, that, by the relaxation of their morals, inclined the balance and drew down the lightning on the land. The terror was only a consequence of their impiety. God, whom nothing longer withheld, let things take their course. Yes, but how can you now prove the necessity of compensations to a world which wanders out of the way in continued accesses of gain? How persuade it that it is an urgent need, as a preventive against new crises, to shelter towns behind the sacred bulwarks of cloisters? After the siege of 1870, Paris was wisely sheltered behind an immense net of impregnable forts. But is it not also indispensable to surround it with a cincture of prayers, to buttress its neighbourhood with conventual houses, to build everywhere in its suburbs convents of Poor Clares, Carmelites, Benedictine nuns of the Blessed Sacrament, monasteries which will be in some degree powerful citadels, destined to arrest the forward march of the armies of evil? Certainly the towns have great need of being guaranteed against infernal invasions by a sanitary defence of orders. But come, sir, I must not deprive you of necessary rest. I will join you tomorrow, before you quit our solitude. I have now but to say that you have only friends here, and that you will always be welcome. I hope that on your side you will keep no unfavourable memory of our poor hospitality, and that you will prove it in coming to see us again. As they talked, they had come in front of the guest-house. The father pressed Durtal's hands, and slowly ascended the stairs, sweeping with his robe the silver dust of the steps, as he mounted, all white, in a ray of the moon. End of Part 2, Chapter 8. Part 2, Chapter 9 of En route by Joris-Karl HUYSMANS, translated by Charles Kegan Paul. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Durtal wished immediately after Mass to visit for the last time that wood through which he had walked, in turns so languidly and so rapidly. He went at first to the old lime alley, whose pale emanations were verily for his spirit what an infusion of their leaves is for the body, a sort of very weak panacea, a kindly and soothing sedative. Then he sat down in their shade on a stone bench. As he leant forward a little, he could see through the moving spaces in the branches the solemn front of the abbey, and opposite, separated by the kitchen garden, the gigantic cross standing before that liquid plan of a church which the pond simulated. He rose and approached the watery cross, of which the sky turned the marble water blue, and he contemplated the great crucifix in white marble, which towered above the whole monastery, and seemed to rise opposite to it as a permanent reminder of the vows of suffering which he had accepted, and reserved to himself to change at length into joys. "The fact is," said Durtal, who thought over again the contradictory declarations of the monks, confessing that they led at once the most attractive and the most atrocious life, "the fact is that the good God deceives them. They attain here below paradise, while they seek hell there. I have myself tasted how strange is existence in this cloister, for I have been here, almost at the same time, very unhappy and very happy. And now I feel well the mirage which is already beginning. Before 2 days are over, the remembrance of the sorrows which then were, if I recall them with care, greatly above the joys, will have disappeared, and I shall only recall those interior emotions in the chapel, those delicious stolen moments in the morning in the pathways of the park. I shall regret the open-air prison of this convent. It is curious I find myself attached to it by obscure bonds. When I am in my cell, there return to me all kinds of memories, like those of an ancient race. I find myself at once at home again, in a place I had never seen. I recognize from the first moment a very special life, of which nevertheless I know nothing. It seems to me that something which interests me, which is indeed personal to me, passed here before I was born. Truly, if I believed in metempsychosis, I might imagine I had been a monk in anterior existences. A bad monk, then, he said, smiling at his reflections, since I should have been obliged to be reincarnate and to return to a cloister to expiate my sins. While thus talking with himself, he had passed across a long alley which led to the end of the enclosure, and cutting across the road and through the thickets, he strayed into the wood of the great pond. It was not in motion, as on certain days when the wind made hollows in it, and swelled it, made it flow and return on itself as soon as it touched its banks. It remained immovable, and was only stirred by the reflections of the moving clouds and of the trees. At moments a leaf fallen from the neighbouring poplars swam on the image of a cloud, at others bubbles of air came from the bottom and burst on the surface in the reflected blue of heaven. Durtal looked for the otter, but it did not show itself. He saw only the swallows which skimmed the water with their wing, the dragonflies which sparkled like jewels, flashing like the blue flames of sulphur. If he had suffered near the cross pond, before the sheet of water of the other pond he could only call up the memory of healing hours, which he had passed lying on a bed of moss, or a couch of dry reeds, and he looked at it tenderly, trying to fix and carry it away in his memory to relive again in Paris, shutting his eyes on the bank. He pursued his walk, and stopped in an alley of chestnuts along the walls above the monastery. Thence he went into the court in front of the cloister, the outbuildings, the stables, the woodsheds, even the pigsties. He tried to see Brother Simeon, but he was probably engaged in the stables, for he did not appear. The buildings were silent, the pigs were shut up. Only some lean cats prowled about in silence, scarcely looking when they met each other, going each on its own side, no doubt seeking some nourishing game which would console them for the eternal meals of vegetable soup served them at the monastery. Time was getting on. He prayed for the last time in the chapel, and went to his cell to get his portmanteau ready. While putting his things in order he thought of the inutility of decorated rooms. He had spent all his money at Paris in buying ornaments and books, for till now he had detested bare walls. But now, considering the blank walls of this room, he admitted to himself that he had done better between these 4 whitewashed walls than in his room at Paris, hung with stuffs. Suddenly he recognized that La Trappe had weaned him from his preferences, had in a few days completely upset him. The power of such an environment, he said to himself, a little alarmed at feeling how he was transformed. And he thought, in buckling his portmanteau, I must, however, go and find Father Etienne, for I must settle my account. I cannot be altogether a debtor to these good people. He went along the corridors, and ended by meeting the father in the court. He was a little confused how to open the question. At the first words the guest-master smiled. "The rule of Saint Benedict is formal," he said. "We must receive our guests as we receive our Lord Jesus himself. That is to tell you that we cannot exchange our poor care for money." And when Durtal insisted, embarrassed, "If it does not suit you to have partaken of our meagre pittance without paying, do as you please. Only the sum which you may give will be distributed in coins of 10 or 20 sous to the poor who come each morning, often from a great distance, to knock at our monastery gate." Durtal bowed and handed the money, which he had ready in his pocket, to the father, but he inquired if he might not have a word with Father Maximin before his departure. "Certainly. Moreover, Father Prior would not have let you go without shaking hands with you. I will go and make certain if he be free. Wait for me in the refectory." And the monk disappeared, and came back a few minutes afterwards, preceded by the prior. "Ah, well," said he, "then you are going to plunge again into the hurly-burly?" "Oh, without any pleasure, Father." "I understand that. It is so good, is it not, no longer to hear anything and to be silent? However, take courage, we will pray for you." And as Durtal thanked both of them for their kind attentions, "It is a pleasure to receive a retreatant such as you," cried Father Etienne. "Nothing repulses you, and you are so exact that you are about before the hour. You rendered my task of overseer easy. If all were as little exacting and as pliable." And he admitted that he had given lodging to priests sent by their bishops as a penance, ecclesiastics of ill repute whose complaints about food, lodging, the need of rising early in the morning, never ceased. "If again," said the prior, "one could hope to recall them to good, to send them back healed to their parishes. But no, they go away still more rebellious than before. The devil does not let them alone." During this conversation a lay brother brought in some dishes covered with plates and placed them on the table. "We have changed the hour of your dinner because of the train," said Father Etienne. "Good appetite, adieu, and may the Lord bless you," said the prior. He raised his hand and enwrapped Durtal with a great sign of the cross, who knelt surprised at the sudden emotion in the monk's tone. But Father Maximin recovered himself at once, and he bowed to him as M. Bruno entered. The meal was silent. The oblate was visibly distressed at the departure of the companion whom he loved, and Durtal looked with a swelling heart at the old man, who had so charitably come out of his solitude to give him aid. "Will you not some day come to see me in Paris?" he said. "No. I have quitted life without any mind to return to it. I am dead to the world. I do not wish to see Paris again. I have no wish to live again. But if God lend me still a few years of existence, I hope to see you here again, for it is not in vain that one has crossed the threshold of mystic asceticism to verify by one's own experience the reality of the requirements which our Lord brings about. Now, as God does not proceed by chance, He will certainly finish His work by sifting you as wheat. I venture to recommend you to try not to give way, and attempt to die in some measure to yourself, in order not to run counter to His plans." "I know well," said Durtal, "that all is displaced in me, that I am no longer the same, but what frightens me is that I am now sure that the works of the Theresian school are exact. Then, if one must pass through the cylinders of the rolling mill which St. John of the Cross describes—" The noise of a carriage in the court interrupted him. M. Bruno went to the window and looked out. "Your luggage is down." "Yes." They looked at each other. "Listen, I would wish indeed to say to you—" "No, no, do not thank me," cried the oblate. "See, I have never so thoroughly understood the misery of my being. Ah, if I had been another man, I might, by praying better, have aided you more." The door opened, and Father Etienne declared, "You have not a minute to lose, if you do not wish to miss the train." Thus hurried, Durtal had only time to press the hand of his friend, who accompanied him to the court. He found waiting a sort of open wagon driven by a Trappist, who, below a bald head, and cheeks streaked with rose threads, had a great black beard. Durtal pressed the hands of the guest-master and the oblate for the last time, when the Father Abbot came in his turn to wish him a safe journey. And at the end of the court Durtal perceived two eyes fixed on him, those of Brother Anacletus, who at a distance said adieu by a slight bow, but without other gesture. Even this poor man, whose eloquent look told of a truly touching affection, had a saint's pity for the stranger whom he had seen so tumultuous and so sad in the desolate solitude of the wood. Certainly the stiffness of the rule forbade all show of feeling to these monks, but Durtal felt thoroughly that for him they had gone to the limit of concessions allowed, and his affliction was great as he cast them in parting a last expression of thanks. And the door of the monastery closed, that door at which he had trembled in arriving, and at which he now looked with tears in his eyes. "We must get on fast," said the procurator, "for we are late," and the horse went at great speed along the lanes. Durtal recognized his companion as having seen him in the chapel singing in the choir during the office. He had an air at once good-natured and firm, and his little grey eye smiled as it glanced behind his branched spectacles. "Well," said he, "how have you borne our regimen?" "I have had every chance. I came here with my stomach out of order, my body ill, and the simple Trappist meals have cured me." And when Durtal narrated briefly the stages of soul he had undergone, the monk murmured, "That is nothing in regard to demoniacal attacks. We have had here true cases of possession." "And Brother Simeon discovered them." "Ah, you know that?" And he replied quite simply to Durtal, who spoke to him of his admiration for the poor lay brothers. "You are right, sir. If you could talk with these peasants and illiterate men, you would be surprised at the often profound answers which these people give you. Then they alone at the monastery are really courageous. We, the fathers, when we think ourselves too weak, accept willingly the authorized addition of an egg. They never. They pray more, and it must be admitted that our Lord listens to them, since they get well again and indeed are never ill." And to a question of Durtal, who asked him in what consisted the functions of the procurator, the monk answered, "They consist in keeping the accounts, in being the commercial agent, in travelling, in managing, alas, everything which does not concern the life of the cloister. But we are so few in number at Notre-Dame-de-Lâtre that we become necessarily jacks of all trades. For instance, Father Etienne is cellarer of the abbey and guest-master. He is also sacristan and bell-ringer. I, too, am first cantor and professor of plain-song. And while the carriage rolled along, shaken by the ruts, the procurator declared to Durtal, who told him how much the officers chanted at the monastery had delighted him, "It is not with us that you ought to hear them. Our choirs are too restricted, too weak to be able to raise the giant mass of those chants. You ought to go to the black monks of Solesmes or Ligugé if you wish to find the Gregorian melodies executed as they were in the Middle Ages. By the way, do you know in Paris the Benedictine nuns in the Rue Monsieur?" "Yes. But do you not think they coo a little?" "I cannot say. All the same their collection of tunes is authentic, but at the little seminary at Versailles you have better still, since they chant there exactly as at Solesmes. Note this well, moreover, at Paris, when the churches decline to repudiate liturgical music, they use for the most part the false notation printed and spread in abundance in all the dioceses in France by the house of Pustet of Ratisbon. But the errors and frauds with which those editions abound are well known. The legend on which its partisans rely is incorrect. To assert, as they do, that this version is no other than that of Palestrina, who was charged by Pope Paul V to revive the musical liturgy of the Church, is an argument destitute of truth and void of force. For everyone knows that when Palestrina died, he had hardly begun the correction of the Gradual. I will add that even if that musician had finished his work, that would not prove that his interpretation ought to be preferred to that which has been recently constituted, after patient researches, by the Abbey of Solesmes, for the Benedictine texts are based on the copy preserved at the monastery of St. Gall of the antiphonary of St. Gregory, which represents the most ancient and the most certain monument which the Church preserves of the true plain chant. This manuscript, of which photographic facsimiles exist, is the code of Gregorian melodies, and it ought to be, if I may use the expression, the pneumatic Bible of choirs. The disciples of St. Benedict are then absolutely right when they declare that their version alone is faithful, alone correct. How then comes it that so many churches get their music from Ratisbon? Alas, how comes it that Pustet has so long acquired the monopoly of liturgical books, but no, better hold one's peace. Take this only for certain, that the German volumes are the absolute negation of the Gregorian tradition, the most complete heresy of plain chant. "By the way, what time is it? We must make haste," said the procurator, looking at the watch which Durtal held up to him. "Come up, my beauty," and he whipped up the mare. "You drive with spirit," cried Durtal. "It is true. I forgot to say to you that over and above my other functions I also have, if need be, that of coachman." Durtal thought all the same that these people were extraordinary who lived an interior life in God. As soon as they consented to redescend on earth, they revealed themselves as the most sagacious and the boldest of business men. An abbot founded a factory with the few pence he succeeded in gathering. He discerned the employment which suited each of his monks, and with them he improvised artisans, writing clerks, transformed a professor of plain chant into an agent, plunged into the tumult of purchases and sales, and little by little the house which scarcely was raised above the soil, grew, put forth shoots, and ended by nourishing with its fruit the abbey which had planted it. Transported into another environment, these people would have as easily created great manufactories and started banks. And it was the same with the women. When one thinks of the practical qualities of a man of business, and the coolness of an old diplomatist which a mother abbess ought to possess in order to rule her community, one is obliged to admit that the only women, truly intelligent, truly remarkable are, outside of drawing-rooms, outside of the world, at the head of cloisters. And as he expressed his wonder aloud, that monks were so expert at setting up business, "It must be so," sighed the father. "But if you believe that we do not regret the time necessarily spent in digging the ground, then our spirit at least was free, then we could sanctify ourselves in silence, which to a monk is as necessary as bread, for it is thanks to it that he stifles vanity as it rises, that he represses disobedience as it murmurs, that he turns all his aspirations, all his thoughts towards God, and becomes at last attentive to his presence. Instead of that... But here we are at the station. Do not trouble yourself about your portmanteau, but go and take your ticket, for I hear the whistle of the train." and in fact Durtal had only time to shake hands with the father, who put his luggage into the carriage. There, when he was alone, seated, looking at the monk as he departed, he felt his heart swell, ready to break. And in the clatter of the rails the train started. Sharply, clearly, in a minute, Durtal took stock of the frightful disorder into which he had thrown the monastery. "Ah, and outside it, all is the same to me, and nothing matters to me," he cried. And he groaned, knowing that he should never more succeed in interesting himself in all that makes the joy of men. The uselessness of caring about any other thing than mysticism and the liturgy, of thinking about aught else save God, implanted itself in him so firmly that he asked himself what would become of him at Paris with such ideas. He saw himself submitting to the confusion of controversies, the cowardice of conventionality, the vanity of declarations, the inanity of proofs. He saw himself bruised and thrust aside by the reflections of everybody, obliged henceforward to advance or retire, dispute or hold his tongue. In any case, peace was forever lost. How, in fact, was he to rally and recover when he was obliged to dwell in a place of passage, in a soul open to all winds, visited by a crowd of public thoughts? His contempt for relations, his disgust for acquaintances grew on him. "No, everything rather than mix myself again with society," he declared to himself, and then he was silent in despair, for he was not ignorant that he could not, apart from the monastic zone, live in isolation. After a short time would come weariness and a void. Therefore, why had he reserved nothing for himself? Why had he trusted all to the cloister? He had not even known how to arrange the pleasure of entering into himself. He had discovered how to lose the amusement of bric-a-brac, how to extirpate that last satisfaction in the white nakedness of a cell. He no longer held to anything, but lay dismantled, saying, "I have renounced almost all the happiness which might fall to me, and what am I going to put in its place?" And terrified, he perceived the disquiet of a conscience ready to torment itself, the permanent reproaches of an acquired lukewarmness, the apprehensions of doubts against faith, fear of furious clamours of the senses stirred by chance meetings. And he repeated to himself that the most difficult thing would not be to master the emotions of his flesh, but indeed to live Christianly, to confess, to communicate at Paris, in a church. He never could get so far as that, and he imagined discussions with the Abbé Gévresin, his gaining time, his refusal, foreseeing that their friendship would come to an end in these disputes. Then where should he fly? At the very recollection of the Trappist monastery, the theatrical representations of Saint-Sulpice made him jump. Saint-Séverin seemed to him distracted and worn. How could he live among stupid people like the devout? How listen without gnashing his teeth to the affected chants of the choirs? How, lastly, could he seek again in the chapel of the Benedictine nuns, and even at Notre-Dame des Victoires, that dull heat radiating from the souls of the monks, and thawing little by little the ice of his poor being? And then it was not even that. What was truly crushing, truly dreadful, was to think that doubtless he would never again feel that admirable joy which lifts you from the ground, carries you, you know not where, nor how, above sense. Ah, those paths at the monastery wandered in at daybreak, those paths where one day after a communion God had dilated his soul in such a fashion that it seemed no longer his own, so much had Christ plunged him in the sea of his divine infinity, swallowed him in the heavenly firmament of his person. How renew that state of grace without communion and outside a cloister? "No, it is all over," he concluded. And he was seized with such an access of sadness, such an outburst of despair, that he thought of getting out at the first station and returning to the monastery. And he had to shrug his shoulders, for his character was not patient enough, nor his will firm enough, nor his body strong enough to support the terrible trials of a novitiate. Moreover, the prospect of having no cell to himself, of sleeping dressed higgledy-piggledy in a dormitory, alarmed him. But what then? And sadly he took stock of himself. "Oh," he thought, "I have lived 20 years in 10 days in that convent, and I leave it, my brain relaxed, my heart in rags. I am done for, forever. Paris and Notre-Dame de l'Âtre have rejected me each in their turn like a waif, and here I am condemned to live apart, for I am still too much a man of letters to become a monk, and yet I am already too much a monk to remain among men of letters." He leapt up and was silent, dazzled by jets of electric light which flooded him as the train stopped. He had returned to Paris. "If they," he said, thinking of those writers whom it would no doubt be difficult not to see again, "if they knew how inferior they are to the lowest of the lay brothers, if they could imagine how the divine intoxication of a Trappist swineherd interests me more than all their conversations and all their books. Oh, Lord, that I might live in the shadow of the prayers of humble brother Simeon."
End of Part 2, Chapter 9. End of En route by Joris-Karl HUYSMANS, translated by Charles Kegan Paul.